Hi everyone. Tonight we're heading somewhere far from quiet villages or cozy cottages. This is Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, where life moved fast, rules ran deep, and everything was watched. Picture a city floating on a lake, full of stone temples, smoky markets, and canals instead of streets. The air is thick with incense and maize. Drums echo from distant plazas. Everyone around you knows the rhythms, the rituals, the rules. You don't. There are no signs in your language. No time to adjust. Step wrong or speak out of place, and you might disrupt something sacred. Tenochtitlan was incredible to look at, but it wasn't built for outsiders. And it wasn't easy to survive. Before we get started, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing the night owls and early risers tuning in from around the world. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let your mind drift. Let's begin with what it was really like to survive a day in Tenochtitlan. It's just before dawn. The air is warm and damp, filled with the scent of clay, maize porridge, and lake water. In the distance, a conch shell sounds. Its low, hollow tone announces the beginning of another day under the eyes of the gods. You are in Tenochtitlan, and the city is already stirring. As the morning light spills over the mountains to the east, stone causeways begin to fill. Vendors prepare their stalls in the Tlatelolco market, carefully arranging chilies, cacao, obsidian blades, and brightly woven cloth. Farmers glide in by canoe, their paddles moving with practiced rhythm. They come from the chinampas, the floating gardens that feed this vast city of hundreds of thousands. You are a stranger here. You don't speak the language. You don't understand the customs. You didn't bow deeply enough to the priest on the corner. You didn't recognize the feathered armband of the noble who passed you by. Already, you've made mistakes. The priest's eyes lingered on you for a moment too long, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something harder. His obsidian-lit plug caught the early light as he turned away, dismissing you with the subtle contempt reserved for the ignorant. The noble, adorned in quetzal feathers that mark his status as a warrior who has taken multiple captives, doesn't even acknowledge your presence. In his world, you are less than shadow, less than breath. You are nothing. This dismissal cuts deeper than you expected. In your own world, perhaps you held some status, some recognition. Here, you are stripped of all identity except the most basic, outsider. The weight of invisibility presses down on you like the humid air itself, thick and suffocating. Social codes in Tenochtitlan are unwritten but absolute. Clothing, hairstyle, even the way you walk, all signal your place in society. As a commoner, you would be expected to rise before the sun, perform morning purification with lake water, and begin your labor. Perhaps you grind maize, carry water, or haul firewood through a maze of narrow paths and canals. There is no leisure in the mornings. There is only the quiet expectation of duty. But even understanding this basic hierarchy doesn't prepare you for its complexity. The woman grinding maize wears a simple hupil, but the pattern woven into its edges tells a story you cannot read. It speaks of her lineage, her kalpuli, perhaps even her personal achievements. The man carrying obsidian tools has scarred hands that speak of decades of craftsmanship, and the way others step aside for him reveals his status among artisans. Every gesture carries meaning. The angle of a bow, the timing of eye contact, the precise way one holds their hands when addressing a superior. You fumble through these interactions like a child learning to walk, each mistake marking you more clearly as foreign, potentially dangerous. In a society where conformity ensures survival, deviation invites scrutiny you cannot afford. The city hums with sound. Wooden flutes, rattling ankle bells worn by dancers, the steady rhythm of obsidian tools. Market criers call out their wares. The smells blend together, thick and rich. Roasted maize, fried fish, copal incense, and cooking fires. The soundscape is unlike anything from your world. There are no metal tools ringing against anvils, no wheels rumbling over stone. Instead, the percussion is organic, alive. Wooden drums beaten with rubber-tipped mallets create rhythms that seem to match the heartbeat of the city itself. Conch shells echo across the water, their calls traveling from temple to temple like a conversation between gods. The market voices rise and fall in patterns that gradually reveal themselves as more than random noise. There's a rhythm to the commerce, a musical quality to the haggling. Vendors chant the qualities of their goods in poetic verses that would seem absurd in any other context, but here feel like prayers offered to the spirits of trade. Clay whistles shaped like birds and jaguars add their voices to the symphony. Children play them as they dart between the legs of adults, their music scattered and joyful. But even their play serves a purpose. They're learning the sounds that will guide them through life, the calls that announce festivals, warnings, celebrations, and mourning. The skyline is dominated by the twin staircases of the Templo Mayor, its summit reaching high into the haze. At its peak, rituals are performed that command attention. Crowds gather in the main square, heads bowed. Priests, dressed in jaguar pelts or crimson-streaked robes, climb the steps. Their chants carry through the air, low and unbroken. The temple complex itself defies easy comprehension. What appears to be a single massive structure reveals itself as layers upon layers of construction, each generation building atop the last. The current pyramid entombs 7 earlier versions, creating a sacred mountain that grows from the accumulated devotion of centuries. The twin temples at the summit serve different gods. Tlaloc, the rain deity whose favor ensures the survival of the Chinampas, and Huitzilopochtli, the war god who demands constant feeding. The duality reflects the balance that keeps Tenochtitlan alive: water and blood, growth and sacrifice, creation and destruction. As you watch, a procession begins. Priests emerge from the temple's base, their bodies painted in patterns that transform them into living embodiments of divine forces. Some are covered in soot and blood, others in blue clay that makes them appear as pieces of sky walking among mortals. Their movements are not human gestures, but ritual choreography that speaks directly to forces beyond human comprehension. You try not to stare. You try to pass unnoticed. But your gaze lingers just a moment too long. A nearby merchant sees. He frowns. You move on. The merchant's frown carries weight beyond simple disapproval. In a society where the sacred and secular intertwine completely, your obvious foreignness to the religious observances marks you as potentially dangerous. Are you a spy from a rival city-state? A traitor from distant lands who might carry disease or hostile magic? Or simply someone whose ignorance could attract divine displeasure to the entire community? His eyes follow you as you retreat, and you notice him speaking quietly to another merchant. Word spreads through the marketplace in whispers and glances. You've become a story being told, a piece of gossip that will travel through the city's social networks faster than you can walk. By midday, your presence will be known in Calpolis you've never visited. The paranoia creeps in as you realize how completely you've exposed yourself. Every misstep is remembered, cataloged, discussed. The city has a memory, and you've already written yourself into it as an anomaly that needs explanation. You pass through Calpolis, neighborhoods defined by shared ancestry and trade. Children balance jugs of water. Elderly women weave cloth in shaded courtyards. In another corner, a boy trains with a makuhaweedle, a weapon edged with razor-sharp obsidian. His movements are precise, practiced, and quiet. He is preparing, like all boys are, for war. Each Calpule functions as a world within the world, a community bound by blood, craft, and mutual obligation. The children carrying water aren't simply performing chores. They're participating in a complex system of reciprocal labor that binds families together across generations. The elderly women weaving aren't just creating cloth. They're preserving patterns that carry the history of their lineage, stories that will be worn on the bodies of their descendants. The architecture itself reflects these bonds. Houses cluster around shared courtyards where communal activities take place. Storage rooms are built to serve multiple families. Temple compounds anchor each kaupuli, their priests serving not just religious functions, but acting as administrators, judges, and keepers of the community's memory. As you walk deeper into residential areas, the privacy that marks your own culture becomes alien. Life spills into courtyards and walkways. Conversations flow between buildings. Children drift seamlessly between households, claimed and fed by the community, rather than isolated within nuclear families. The boy with the makua weedle represents every male child's destiny. From the age of 6, boys begin learning the warrior's path. They practice not just with weapons, but with the rituals that transform killing into sacred service. They learn the prayers that must be spoken before battle, the methods for taking captives alive, the protocols for offering prisoners to the gods. But warfare in Tenochtitlan serves purposes beyond mere conquest. It's a mechanism for acquiring tribute, for gaining captives for sacrifice, for allowing young men to prove their worth and advance in status. The boy's training prepares him for a world where personal valor and divine service merge into a single calling. The ethos of the warrior is everywhere. Even the calm of morning carries the echo of battle. Boys are taught the art of combat. Warriors earn status through ritual capture, not just victory. The sun itself, they believe, needs sacrifice to rise. The world continues only because it is paid for. This philosophy permeates every aspect of daily life. The market vendors who sell obsidian blades know that their products may soon taste blood in ritual service. The women who weave warrior costumes understand that their artistry helps transform men into instruments of the god's will. Even the farmers and their chinampas work within a system where agricultural surplus supports the warrior class that protects and expands the empire. The cosmology underlying this warrior culture sees the universe as fundamentally unstable, requiring constant intervention to prevent collapse. The sun fights a daily battle against the forces of darkness and needs human sacrifice to fuel its strength. The earth itself is a living entity that demands feeding through blood offerings. Humanity's role is not to live in harmony with nature, but to actively maintain the cosmic order through violent service. This creates a society where death is not feared but courted, where the highest honor comes from dying in battle or on the sacrificial stone. Young warriors compete not just for victory, but for the chance to achieve the ultimate glory, a death that feeds the gods and ensures the world's continuation. By midday, the heat presses down. You're sweating and uncertain. The streets are a web of stone and water. You've walked past the same wall more than once. You stop someone to ask for directions, but your mispronunciation offends. He says nothing. He simply turns away. The city's layout confounds every expectation. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, Tenochtitlan spreads across a network of natural and artificial land masses connected by bridges and causeways. What appears to be solid ground often proves to be carefully engineered platforms built up from lake-bottom mud and organic matter. The streets themselves follow patterns that reflect both practical needs and cosmic symbolism. Major avenues align with astronomical observations, creating a city that serves as both urban center and massive ritual calendar. Smaller paths wind through Kaupalis according to the logic of kinship and trade, relationships rather than geometric efficiency. Water flows everywhere through engineered canals that serve multiple purposes: transportation, waste management, irrigation, and defense. The system is so sophisticated that Spanish conquistadors will later marvel at its complexity, comparing it favorably to Venice while simultaneously plotting its destruction. Your attempt to ask for directions reveals another layer of cultural complexity. The man you approached recognized not just your foreign accent, but the inappropriate nature of your request. In Aztec society, knowledge of the city's geography is tied to membership in the community. Asking for directions implies that you belong somewhere, but have lost your way. Since you clearly don't belong anywhere, your question marks you as either a spy attempting to gather intelligence or a fool too dangerous to assist. His silence is not rudeness, but a form of social protection. Engaging with an unknown outsider could bring scrutiny from authorities or invite supernatural danger. Better to pretend the interaction never happened than to risk contamination by foreign influence. You find a small food stall near a canal. You sit. You try to appear relaxed. The woman behind the stall offers you tamales wrapped in maize husks, flavored with beans and chili. You eat without question. Hunger is easy to understand, even here. The food stall represents one of the few spaces where social barriers relax slightly. Commerce creates temporary relationships that transcend normal boundaries, though even here, unwritten rules govern every exchange. The woman serving food evaluated you quickly, noting your foreign features and strange clothing, but your obvious hunger and willingness to pay override her caution. The tamale itself is a marvel of engineering and artistry that you consume without appreciation. The masa has been ground to perfect consistency, mixed with lard rendered from turkey fat, and seasoned with combinations of chili and herbs that represent generations of culinary refinement. The beans have been carefully selected and prepared according to recipes that balance nutrition, flavor, and sacred symbolism. Even the corn husk wrapping serves multiple purposes. It preserves the tamale during cooking, adds subtle flavor during steaming, and provides a biodegradable container that will decompose harmlessly when discarded. Every element reflects the sophisticated understanding of resources that allows a city of this size to thrive in a lake environment. But your appreciation extends only to satisfying hunger. You miss the small ritual performed by the vendor, the quiet prayer of gratitude to the corn goddess who provided the meal. You don't notice the way she arranges the cooking fire to honor the directions and elements. You consume the product of sacred labor as if it were mere fuel, another small offense that marks you as spiritually blind. The day stretches on. The marketplace pulses with life. Traders offer dried insects, colored feathers, carved gourds, and powdered dyes. A drummer beats time beneath a tree. His slow, steady rhythm follows you as you walk. The Tlatelolco market operates as the economic heart of an empire that stretches from coast to coast. Goods flow here from tropical lowlands and highland mountains, from desert regions and fertile valleys. The scale of commerce would be impressive in any era. Tens of thousands of people buying and selling everything from everyday necessities to luxury items that speak of wealth and power beyond imagining. Cacao beans serve as currency, but the economy operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Barter exchanges labor for goods. Tribute payments flow from conquered territories to the imperial center, and gift relationships bind nobles across vast distances. The market reflects all these systems operating at once, creating a complexity that defies simple understanding. The dried insects that disgust you are carefully prepared protein, sources that represent sophisticated understanding of nutrition. Grasshoppers are seasoned with salt and chili, their flavor comparing favorably to modern snack foods. Ant larvae are harvested at specific seasons when their flavor peaks. Even the worms that make you turn away are considered delicacies worth more than meat from larger animals. Feathers function as both luxury goods and religious symbols. The brilliant green plumes of quetzal birds can only be obtained from Central American forests, making them more valuable than gold. They adorn the costumes of priests and nobles, transforming human beings into earthly representatives of divine forces. The trade networks that bring these feathers to Tenochtitlan span thousands of miles and represent diplomatic relationships maintained across generations. The drummer beneath the tree provides more than entertainment. His rhythms carry coded information that trained listeners can interpret. News from distant regions, announcements of official policies, reminders of upcoming festivals. Music in Tenochtitlan serves as a communication system that supplements spoken language, carrying information across the city more efficiently than any messenger could. Powdered dyes represent another layer of technological sophistication that escapes your notice. The brilliant red comes from cochineal insects cultivated on cactus plants, a process so complex that European chemists will spend centuries trying to replicate it. The deep blue derives from indigo plants, processed according to techniques that produce colors more vivid than anything known in the old world. By late afternoon, the light begins to slant. The shadow of the temple stretches across the plaza. Another conch shell sounds. This time, the crowd falls silent. A ceremony is beginning. The afternoon ceremony represents a daily renewal of the compact between humanity and the divine forces that govern existence. As shadows lengthen, the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the gods becomes permeable. This is the time when offerings can be made, when prayers can be heard, when the cosmic order can be reinforced through proper ritual action. The conch shell's call carries across the entire city, audible even in the furthest Kaupilis and across the lake to surrounding settlements. Its sound is not just an announcement, but an invitation for all residents to participate in the collective ritual that ensures another day's survival. Those who cannot attend the ceremony physically can still contribute through prayer and meditation, adding their spiritual energy to the communal effort. The crowd's immediate silence reflects deep understanding of the sacred moment's requirements. This is not an audience gathering to watch a performance, but a congregation preparing to participate in cosmic maintenance. Every person present becomes a component in a spiritual technology designed to maintain universal balance. You are drawn in, caught in the current of bodies. The drums begin again. The priests ascend. You can't see the top of the stairs, but you can feel the weight of the moment. People chant, some bow, some look on in silence. The physical sensation of being carried along by the crowd provides your first genuine experience of Aztec community. For a moment, your foreignness becomes irrelevant as you participate in something larger than individual identity. The mass of bodies creates its own momentum, its own logic, drawing you into participation despite your ignorance. The drumming that begins is not random percussion, but a precise acoustic technology designed to alter consciousness. The rhythms match heartbeat patterns that induce trance states, allowing participants to experience direct communion with divine forces. Different drum patterns produce different spiritual effects, from mild meditation to profound ecstatic experience. The priests ascending the temple stairs move according to choreography that has been refined over centuries. Each step is timed to match the drumming, each gesture coordinated with astronomical observations. They climb not just a physical structure, but a symbolic representation of the cosmic mountain where gods dwell, their ascent transforming them into intermediaries between earthly and divine realms. The chanting that rises from the crowd follows patterns that predate the city itself, songs that encode mythological narratives and astronomical observations. Participants who join the chanting add their voices to a collective prayer that has been offered continuously for generations, linking them to ancestors and descendants in an unbroken chain of devotion. This is not a performance. It is a covenant between gods and people, and you begin to understand that this place is not here for you. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't slow down. It turns on its own rhythm, ancient and exacting. The realization hits with devastating clarity. You are witnessing a civilization that operates according to principles completely alien to your understanding. This is not a society that can be judged by external standards or reformed according to foreign values. It exists as a complete system, internally consistent and self-sustaining, requiring no validation from outside observers. The covenant being renewed through ceremony is not symbolic, but literal. The gods are real forces that must be acknowledged and fed. The rituals are not traditions, but technologies that maintain cosmic stability. The hierarchy is not social convention, but divine mandate that ensures proper relationships between all levels of existence. Your presence here is not just foreign, but potentially dangerous. You carry with you assumptions and expectations that could disrupt the delicate balance that keeps this world functioning. Your very existence as an outsider threatens the purity of a system that has developed over centuries to serve specific cosmic purposes. The exacting rhythm that governs everything from market transactions to religious ceremonies reflects deep understanding of universal patterns that govern existence itself. Time is not linear progression, but cyclical renewal, requiring constant vigilance and intervention to prevent collapse into chaos. As dusk settles, the canoes return to the water. Smoke curls from small fires. Laughter echoes faintly in the alleyways. The city breathes out again, just a little. The transition from day to evening marks another critical moment in the daily cycle of cosmic maintenance. As the sun completes its battle against darkness and prepares for its nightly journey through the underworld, human activity must shift to support the next phase of divine struggle. The returning canoes carry not just farmers and fishermen, but participants in the sacred economy that feeds both body and spirit. Cooking fires that kindle throughout the city serve multiple purposes beyond food preparation. They create points of light that help guide the sun through its underground passage, their smoke carrying prayers upward to divine realms. The specific woods burned, the patterns of flame tending, even the arrangement of cooking implements all follow protocols that transform mundane activities into religious service. The laughter echoing through alleyways might seem like simple human joy, but it represents something more complex. The relief that comes from successfully completing another day of cosmic maintenance. Each laugh acknowledges the collaborative victory over forces that constantly threaten to unravel the world's fabric. Children's voices mix with adult conversation as families gather for evening meals. Stories are told that preserve historical memories and mythological knowledge. Elders share wisdom that will guide the next generation's participation in the eternal struggle between order and chaos. But you're still a stranger, still out of place. And if another day comes, you're not sure you'll last much longer. The weight of cultural isolation presses down more heavily as darkness approaches. Night in Tenochtitlan belongs to different forces than those that govern daylight hours. Supernatural dangers emerge that require specific knowledge to navigate safely. Protocols for evening behavior, protective rituals, and community support systems all assume membership in social networks that remain closed to you. Sleep itself becomes problematic when you don't know the prayers that protect against nighttime. Spirits are the physical arrangements that ensure spiritual safety. The sounds of the city at night follow patterns that carry meaning for residents, but remain incomprehensible to foreign ears. Your survival depends on invisibility that becomes harder to maintain as your accumulated mistakes mark you more clearly as an outsider. Each failed interaction, each cultural misstep, each moment of obvious ignorance adds to a growing profile that makes you increasingly visible to forces that don't tolerate anomalies. The approaching night brings not just darkness, but a different kind of revelation about the world you've stumbled into. This is a place where belonging is not optional, but essential for survival, where community membership provides not just social support, but spiritual protection against forces that destroy the unaffiliated. Your stomach rebels against the unfamiliar spices from the tamale, cramping with a pain that doubles you over beside a canal. The lake water laps against stone steps worn smooth by countless feet, and you realize that even your body has become a liability. Every biological function marks you as foreign. Your sweat smells different. Your breath carries the residue of foods that don't grow in this valley. Even your saliva tastes wrong in a mouth, unaccustomed to the mineral-rich lake water that everyone else drinks without thought. A group of young nobles passes by, their elaborate feathered headdresses creating moving sculptures against the evening sky. They wear cloaks woven with geometric patterns that encode their lineages, their military achievements, their spiritual obligations. One carries a shield decorated with turquoise mosaic work, so intricate that each tiny stone has been individually shaped and fitted. Another bears a staff topped with jaguar claws and gold bells that chime softly with each step. They move with the confident grace of men who have never questioned their place in the cosmic order. Their laughter carries the ease of those who know that every door will open, every head will bow, every path will clear before them. They pass you without acknowledgement, but their presence makes your own displacement more acute. You are not simply poor or foreign. You are outside the very categories that define human worth in this place. The evening air fills with new sounds as the city transitions into its nocturnal rhythms. From hidden courtyards come the voices of women singing as they prepare the evening meal, their songs following patterns that coordinate cooking times and honor the corn goddess who provides sustenance. The melodies are mathematical, encoding information about temperature, timing, and seasonal variations that ensure perfect results every time. Professional storytellers begin their work in small plazas, their voices carrying the epic narratives that preserve historical memory and teach proper behavior. Children gather in circles, learning about the heroes who founded their calpolis, the battles that secured their territories, the divine interventions that saved their ancestors from destruction. These are not entertainment, but education, the transmission of knowledge essential for community survival. Night vendors appear with goods suited to darkness. Copal incense for household rituals, obsidian mirrors for scrying, bundles of herbs that provide protection against malevolent spirits. Their wares remind you that evening in Tenochtitlan requires active preparation, specific knowledge, particular tools. You possess none of these things. The temperature drops as the sun disappears behind the western mountains, and you realize you have no shelter, no blanket, no knowledge of where someone like you might safely spend the night. The city's hospitality extends only to those who can reciprocate, who bring something valuable to exchange relationships. You offer nothing but disruption and confusion. Water taxis continue operating even as full darkness settles, their operators navigating by landmarks invisible to untrained eyes. They read the lake's surface like a text, understanding how wind patterns, water temperature, and seasonal variations create signatures that guide safe passage. Their boats carry late merchants returning from distant markets, priests traveling between temple complexes, and messengers bearing communications too sensitive for daytime delivery. The chinampas that seemed so peaceful during daylight hours now reveal their role in the city's defensive strategy. These floating gardens can be rapidly reconfigured to create barriers, channels, and hiding places that transform the lake into a maze impenetrable to enemies unfamiliar with its secrets. Farmers who tend crops by day become naval warriors by night, their agricultural tools doubling as weapons when necessity demands. You wander toward the great plaza, drawn by the promise of open space and perhaps some shelter among the temple buildings. But even here, the night brings activities that exclude outsiders. Priests emerge for ceremonies that require darkness, their bodies painted with phosphorescent pigments that make them appear as living constellations moving across the sacred precinct. Astronomical observations begin that will guide agricultural decisions, military planning, and religious scheduling for the coming months. Priest astronomers use instruments made from polished obsidian and precisely cut jade to track celestial movements with accuracy that surpasses anything known in other parts of the world. Their calculations influence everything from market schedules to marriage arrangements to the timing of wars. The plaza fills with advanced students from the Comakak, the elite school where noble children learn the complex arts of governance. They practice debate techniques that will serve them as judges and administrators. Memorize legal codes that govern everything from property disputes to religious obligations. And study the philosophical principles that justify Aztec dominance over surrounding peoples. These young scholars represent the intellectual elite of an empire, their minds trained to synthesize information from dozens of different fields: mathematics, astronomy, history, poetry, military strategy, religious doctrine, and diplomatic protocol. They speak multiple languages, read both pictographic and phonetic writing systems, and can recite genealogies that trace noble lineages back to mythological times. Their evening discussions reveal the sophistication of Aztec political thought. They debate the proper balance between central authority and local autonomy, the ethical implications of imperial expansion, the theological questions raised by incorporating foreign gods into the pantheon. Their conversations demonstrate intellectual rigor that challenges every assumption about primitive, indigenous societies. But their very sophistication makes your presence more problematic. These are individuals trained to detect anomalies, to identify threats, to protect the system that has elevated them to positions of authority. Your obvious foreignness triggers their analytical instincts, making you an object of study rather than a fellow human being. A patrol of warrior police appears, their obsidian-edged clubs marking them as enforcers of public order. They move through the plaza with practiced efficiency, checking on merchant stalls, verifying the identity of late visitors, ensuring that evening activities conform to established protocols. Their presence reminds you that Tenochtitlan operates under constant surveillance. That deviation from normal patterns attracts immediate attention. The city's law enforcement system operates on principles alien to your experience. Crime is understood not as individual moral failure, but as cosmic disruption that threatens community stability. Punishment serves not just to correct wrongdoing, but to restore universal balance through ritual means. Theft might be addressed through public humiliation that reintegrates the offender into social networks, while treason could require sacrifice that feeds the gods and cleanses the community of contamination. As the patrol approaches your location, you instinctively retreat toward the shadows. But even this defensive action marks you as suspicious. Innocent residents don't flee from legitimate authority. Your evasion confirms that you pose some kind of threat, though its nature remains unclear. The complexity of navigating social interactions becomes overwhelming as fatigue clouds your judgment. Every conversation requires knowledge you don't possess. Every gesture demands cultural fluency you haven't developed. Every decision could trigger consequences you can't predict. The accumulated stress of constant vigilance leaves you exhausted and increasingly prone to the mistakes that could prove fatal. Street food vendors who seemed friendly during daylight hours now view you with suspicion as your appearance deteriorates and your behavior becomes more erratic. The woman who sold you tamales earlier refuses to make eye contact when you approach her stall again. Word has spread through informal networks that you represent some kind of problem, though no one can quite articulate what kind. The absence of written signs or posted regulations makes the city's rules invisible to outsiders, but perfectly clear to residents. Everyone knows which areas are restricted after dark, which activities require special permission, which behaviors attract unwanted attention. This knowledge flows through social networks that exclude you completely, leaving you to navigate by trial and error in situations where mistakes carry serious consequences. Temple bells ring the night hours with a precision that reflects astronomical calculations reaching back centuries. Each bell's tone corresponds to specific divine forces that influence different aspects of human activity. The sequence of sounds creates a temporal map that guides proper behavior throughout the night, but without cultural initiation, you hear only random noise. The lake itself becomes more dangerous after dark, as supernatural forces that sleep during daylight hours begin to stir. Water spirits that could drown the unwary, animal guides that might lead travelers astray, ancestral ghosts seeking resolution of ancient grievances all require specific protocols for safe interaction. These protocols are taught from childhood to community members, but remain completely unknown to outsiders. Your growing desperation makes you increasingly visible to forces that prey on the vulnerable and unprotected. Thieves who avoid well-connected residents might see you as safe prey. Corrupt officials looking for bribes could target someone with no social networks to provide protection. Even supernatural entities might be drawn to the spiritual void created by your disconnection from community support systems. The realization dawns that surviving a single day in Tenochtitlan might be possible through luck and careful observation, but extending that survival indefinitely would require fundamental transformation of identity. You would need to abandon everything that makes you who you are and rebuild yourself according to Aztec categories of meaning and value. This transformation would demand not just learning new skills or adopting different customs, but accepting a completely different understanding of reality itself. You would need to believe in gods you've never worshipped, accept social hierarchies that contradict your basic assumptions about human equality, participate in rituals that violate your moral sensibilities, and dedicate your life to maintaining cosmic balances that seem arbitrary and cruel. Even attempting such transformation would mark you as spiritually contaminated, someone whose foreign origins make them unsuitable for full integration into the community. The best you could hope for would be marginal acceptance as a useful outsider, always suspect, always watched, always expendable when circumstances demand sacrifice. The night deepens around you, and with it comes the understanding that your situation is not merely difficult, but ultimately hopeless. You cannot become Aztec, and you cannot survive as anything else. The civilization that seemed so vibrant and impressive during daylight reveals itself in darkness as a closed system that offers no space for deviation, no tolerance for difference, no mercy for those who cannot or will not conform. To understand how a city so complex and vibrant could fall in a matter of months, we now drift forward in time. The marketplaces fade, the temple square quiets, and the lake begins to ripple with unease. The same social bonds that create such strength within the community will prove vulnerable to disruption from outside forces that operate according to completely different principles. The religious certainty that provides cosmic stability will be shaken by the arrival of beings who seem to possess divine powers but serve alien gods. The economic networks that stretch across continents will become vectors for diseases that no ritual can cure. The warriors who train with such dedication will find they're captured, obsidian weapons inadequate against steel armor and gunpowder. The priests whose ceremonies maintain universal balance will discover that their gods cannot protect against smallpox and typhus. The market systems that coordinate vast trading networks will collapse under the weight of demographic catastrophe. But most devastating of all, the very completeness of Aztec civilization, its perfect internal consistency, and cosmic integration will leave no space for adaptation when faced with forces that cannot be incorporated into existing categories of understanding. Let's move now to the final days of Tenochtitlan, when the city faced its greatest test. A siege led not by warriors of the sun, but by unfamiliar men with iron, horses, and a different kind of god. The strangers approaching from the east carry with them not just weapons and diseases, but an entirely different conception of how the universe operates. They worship a god who demands exclusive devotion, denying the reality of all other divine forces. They practice warfare aimed not at capturing prisoners for sacrifice, but at complete destruction of enemy societies. They see the natural world not as a living entity requiring constant ritual maintenance, but as raw material to be exploited for human benefit. The confrontation about to unfold will be more than military conquest. It will be a collision between incompatible realities, a cosmic catastrophe that will leave one worldview completely destroyed and the other forever changed by the violence required for its victory. We begin the story of the fall. The sound of drums fades into something quieter now. A different kind of tension hums beneath the surface. It is the early 16th century, and Tenochtitlan still stands proud, shining from the heart of Lake Texcoco. But change has arrived, and it moves slowly at first, like a distant storm that no one quite believes will reach them. The city itself defied comprehension. Built upon an island in the middle of a vast lake, connected to the mainland by 4 great causeways that stretched like fingers across the water, Tenochtitlan was unlike anything Europeans had ever imagined. Its population rivaled that of Paris or London, perhaps exceeding 200,000 souls living in harmony with the rhythms of lake and sky. The morning mist would rise from the water, wrapping the temple pyramids in ethereal clouds before the sun burned it, a way to reveal the geometric precision of streets laid out in perfect grids. Canals crisscrossed the urban landscape like arteries, carrying not just people in their dugout canoes, but the lifeblood of commerce. Flowers floated downstream from the floating gardens, the chinampas, where corn and beans and squash grew in impossible abundance. The scent of copal incense drifted from countless shrines, mixing with the aroma of chili peppers roasting in the great market of Tlatelolco. Here, merchants from distant lands brought jade from Guatemala, cacao from the tropical lowlands, and obsidian so pure it could cut flesh cleaner than any European blade. The great temple dominated the sacred precinct at the city's heart, its twin staircases climbing toward heaven like a mountain built by human hands. At its summit, twin shrines honored Tlaloc, the rain god, and Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. Blood had consecrated these stones for generations, but it was ritual blood, sacred blood given with ceremony and purpose to maintain the delicate balance between earth and sky, between the world of the living and the realm of the gods. This was the world that Hermann Kortz encountered when he defied his superior's orders and set sail from Cuba in February 1519. Kortz was not a king, nor even a general by birth. He was a Spanish conquistador, ambitious and uninvited. Born in Medellin, a minor town in the Spanish province of Extremadura, he had studied law at the University of Salamanca before abandoning his books for the promise of gold and glory in the New World. Like so many of his generation, he was shaped by the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to reclaim Spain from Muslim rule, and by tales of the fantastic wealth that Columbus and his successors had found across the Atlantic. When he landed on the coast of Cozumel and then the Yucatan Peninsula, Kortz commanded 11 ships carrying approximately 600 men. They brought with them 16 horses, creatures unknown in the Americas, whose hoofbeats would thunder like supernatural omens across lands that had never known such beasts. They carried crossbows and arquebuses, primitive firearms that spat fire and death with sounds like breaking thunder. Most importantly, though they did not know it, they carried invisible weapons: smallpox, typhus, measles, and other European diseases that would prove more devastating than any sword. But Kortz also brought something else, something that would prove equally powerful: an intuitive understanding of political leverage and the art of making allies from enemies. His first stroke of genius came in the form of a woman. Malinche, known to the Spanish as Dona Marina, was a Nahua woman who had been enslaved and given to Kortz as a tribute gift. She spoke both Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and Maya, which one of Kortz's men, Geronimo de Aguilar, had learned during his own captivity years before. Through this chain of translation, Kortz gained not just the ability to communicate, but insight into the complex web of alliances, resentments, and fears that held the Aztec Empire together. For the Aztec Empire was not monolithic. It was a confederation of city-states, some willing subjects. Others conquered peoples who paid tribute through gritted teeth. The triple alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan ruled over millions. But that rule was maintained through a delicate balance of diplomacy, intimidation, and the constant flow of tribute. Precious stones, feathers, cacao, and human lives for sacrifice. As Cortés moved inland from the coast, he quickly learned to exploit these fractures. In Sempoala, he found the Totonacs chafing under Aztec rule, their tribute payments a constant drain on their resources. With careful promises and displays of Spanish military might, he convinced them to become his allies. When Aztec tribute collectors arrived, Cortés had them arrested, then secretly released them with messages of friendship from Moctezuma, playing all sides with the skill of a master diplomat. But it was in Tlaxcala that Cortés found his most crucial alliance. The Tlaxcalans had resisted Aztec expansion for generations, maintaining their independence through constant warfare and their strategic position in the mountains east of the Valley of Mexico. When the Spanish first encountered Tlaxcalan forces, the result was a series of fierce battles that tested both sides. The Tlaxcalans fought with disciplined formations of warriors, carrying obsidian-edged clubs called mecuahuitl, weapons so sharp they could decapitate a horse with a single blow, and with atlatls that could hurl darts with bone-piercing force. For the Spanish, these battles were a revelation. The indigenous warriors were not the primitive savages that European prejudice expected, but sophisticated soldiers with complex tactics, advanced metallurgy for their tools and ornaments, and a deep understanding of their terrain. Spanish accounts, filtered through the biases of conquest and the need to justify their actions to the crown, nevertheless could not entirely disguise their respect for their opponent's military prowess. After weeks of warfare that cost both sides dearly, Tlaxcalan elders made the pragmatic choice to ally with these strange newcomers. The enemy of their enemy could become their friend, especially if that friend carried weapons that could tip the balance against Tenochtitlan. This alliance would prove decisive, providing not just thousands of additional warriors, but local knowledge, supply lines, and the legitimacy that came from indigenous support. Meanwhile, in Tenochtitlan, Emperor Moctezuma II wrestled with impossible choices. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the Younger, had ruled the Aztec Empire for nearly 2 decades. When reports of strange visitors first reached his court, he was a thoughtful ruler, known for his piety and his attention to the complex rituals that maintained cosmic harmony. The Mexico people believed that their world was the 5th sun, created after 4 previous worlds had been destroyed by the gods. This 5th sun would also end, consumed by earthquakes when the gods tired of human imperfection. Every ritual, every sacrifice, every careful observance of the calendar was designed to postpone that inevitable destruction. Now came news that defied understanding. Men with pale skin and hair on their faces, riding atop great beasts, carrying weapons that thundered like Tlaloc storms. Some among his advisors whispered that these might be toils, gods or god messengers, perhaps even the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who had sailed east across the waters in ancient times with promises to return. The Aztecs knew something was coming. There were omens, or so it was later said. Strange lights in the sky, recorded by the court astronomers who tracked every celestial movement. Twin-headed animals born and quickly dead. Violations of natural order that spoke of cosmic disturbance. The temple of Huitzilopochtli, god of war, was said to have caught fire without warning, its flames consuming offerings and sacred objects while leaving the stone pyramid mysteriously unmarked. A comet had appeared in the sky years before, its tail pointing like an accusing finger toward the heart of the empire. These were signs the old priests read with furrowed brows and whispered warnings. Moctezuma consulted them all, the keepers of the sacred books, the readers of obsidian mirrors, the interpreters of dreams, and the flights of birds. Their counsel was divided, uncertain, filled with the kind of ambiguity that made decision impossible, but action necessary. When Cortés first approached Tenochtitlan in November 1519, he was not met with arrows. He was met with gifts. The Spanish procession that approached the great causeway of Iztapalapa was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Spanish conquistadors in their steel armor marched alongside Tlaxcalan warriors in their feathered regalia. The Their allied ranks swelled by porters and warriors from a dozen different indigenous groups. Horses pranced and snorted, their riders sitting like armored centaurs, while crossbowmen and arquebusiers carried their exotic weapons with the casual confidence of men who had tested them in battle. Emperor Moctezuma II, ruler of the Mexica, chose diplomacy first. Perhaps he believed this foreigner to be a god, or a god's messenger. Perhaps he hoped that peace would delay something worse. Perhaps he simply could not comprehend the true nature of what was approaching his city. The meeting on the causeway was choreographed with all the ceremony that Aztec protocol demanded. Moctezuma, carried on a golden litter and shaded by a canopy of brilliant feathers, stepped down to meet courts on foot, an unprecedented honor that spoke to the gravity of the moment. The exchange of gifts followed ancient patterns. Moctezuma presented courts with necklaces of golden suns and silver moons, with cloaks of quetzal feathers so fine they seemed to capture light itself, with shields decorated with gold and precious stones. In return, courts offered European glass beads, mirrors, and other trade goods that seemed paltry by comparison, but which represented technologies unknown in the Americas. Yet beneath the ceremony lay a fundamental misunderstanding. For Moctezuma, these gifts were part of the diplomatic dance, gestures that established relationships and obligations between rulers. For courts, they were confirmation of the wealth that Spanish dreams had promised, tangible proof that conquest would bring unimaginable riches. Cortés was welcomed into the city, and for a brief, tense moment, two empires shared breath beneath the same sky. The Spanish were housed in the palace of Axayacatl, Moctezuma's predecessor, a vast complex of rooms and courtyards that could accommodate their entire force. For several days, an uneasy peace prevailed. The Spanish marveled at Tenochtitlan's engineering marvels, the aqueducts that brought fresh water from Chapultepec springs, the dikes that controlled the lake's water levels, the floating gardens that fed the city. They visited the great market of Tlatelolco, where Bernal Diaz del Castillo later claimed that more goods changed hands in a single day than in Salamanca in a week. But beneath the surface, tensions multiplied like cracks in drying mud. The Spanish were appalled by Aztec religious practices, particularly human sacrifice, which they saw as devil worship that justified any action taken against their hosts. The Aztecs, meanwhile, gradually realized that these visitors were not gods, but men with an insatiable appetite for gold and an aggressive disregard for the sacred boundaries that govern civilized behavior. When Spanish soldiers began melting down golden artifacts to test their purity, horrified Aztec nobles saw not practical assessment, but sacrilege against objects blessed by the gods. Cultural misunderstandings multiplied. The Spanish could not comprehend a society where merchants might be more honored than warriors, where mathematical and astronomical knowledge was preserved in books made from bark paper, where gardens could float on water and cities could be built on lakes. The Aztecs, in turn, struggled to understand visitors who seemed to worship gold more fervently than they honored their own gods, who showed no interest in the complex reciprocal obligations that bound their society together. But it did not last. The alliance frayed quickly. Cortés, calculating and bold, took Moctezuma as a hostage within his own palace. It was not a clean takeover, nor one without confusion. The Spanish version of events, recorded by Cortés himself in his letters to King Charles V and by his soldiers in their memoirs, presents this as a necessary precaution against Aztec treachery. According to these accounts, Cortés had learned of an attack on Spanish forces on the coast and needed to secure his position in the capital. But Aztec accounts, preserved in indigenous codices and in testimonies collected years later by Spanish priests, suggest a different narrative. They describe the gradual revelation of Spanish intentions, the growing recognition that these visitors came not as traders or ambassadors, but as conquerors. They speak of Moctezuma's increasing isolation from his own nobles, who saw his accommodation of the Spanish as weakness or worse. betrayal of the gods who had elevated the Mexica to dominion over their world. The taking of Moctezuma as a hostage, whatever its immediate justification, represented a fundamental violation of Aztec concepts of legitimate authority. An emperor who could be held captive by foreigners in his own palace was no longer an emperor in any way that mattered. The divine mandate that justified Aztec rule, the covenant between the gods and their chosen people, had been broken. While Cortés left the city briefly to face a rival Spanish force on the coast, a punitive expedition sent by Diego Velázquez, a governor of Cuba, to arrest him for his unauthorized conquest, his men, left behind in Tenochtitlan under the command of Pedro de Alvarado, committed an act that would light the fuse. During a sacred festival dedicated to Toxcatl, a celebration honoring Tezcatlipoca, the god of night and judgment, Spanish soldiers attacked unarmed Aztec nobles in the main temple courtyard. The festival of Toxcatl was one of the most important ceremonies in the Aztec calendar, a time when the boundaries between human and divine became permeable through ritual dance, music, and offerings. Hundreds of nobles, priests, and warriors had gathered in the sacred precinct, wearing their finest regalia, their bodies painted with sacred designs, their movements tracing ancient patterns that connected earth to sky. The Spanish claimed they had learned of a plot against them, that the ceremony was cover for a planned uprising. Aztec witnesses described a different scene, soldiers watching from the doorways as the dance reached its crescendo, then moving suddenly to block all exits before falling upon the celebrants with swords and crossbows. The reason, perhaps, was fear, or misunderstanding, or simply the will to dominate that had driven Spanish expansion across 2 continents. The result was a massacre. Blood pooled on sacred ground, mixing with the flower petals and copal incense that had been scattered for the gods. Bodies fell across the stone steps of the temple, their regalia torn and bloodied, their sacred ornaments trembled underfoot. The drums of celebration became the drums of war as survivors spread word of the atrocity throughout the city. Spanish accounts of the massacre are notably brief and defensive, suggesting that even they recognized the horror of what had occurred. But indigenous sources describe it in devastating detail, the way the dancers' feet continued to move even as they fell, the sound of obsidian ornaments shattering against stone, the cries of wounded men calling for help that would never come. When Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan after defeating the expedition sent against him, a victory that had actually strengthened his position by providing him with additional men and supplies, he found a city transformed. The people had risen. Barricades appeared overnight on every street corner, built from the stones of torn-up causeways and the wooden planks of destroyed bridges. Bridges were removed from causeways, leaving gaps that could only be crossed by boats controlled by Aztec forces. Canoes patrolled the canals like schools of predatory fish, their crews armed with ladles and slings, ready to strike at any Spanish force that ventured onto the water. The streets no longer welcomed them. Where once Spanish soldiers had moved freely through the city, now every intersection held the possibility of ambush. Where once Aztec citizens had watched them with a mixture of curiosity and awe, now hostile eyes tracked their every movement from behind the geometric patterns of screened windows and from the shadows of temple doorways. The siege had begun, but this was not a conventional siege, as Europeans understood such things. European sieges typically involved surrounding a walled city, cutting off its supplies, and waiting for starvation or disease to force surrender. Tenochtitlan presented unique challenges that required adaptation of traditional siege tactics. It was a slow and suffocating kind of battle. Tenochtitlan was not a city easily taken. It was built on water, accessible only by narrow causeways that could be easily defended, and its people were trained, disciplined, and fiercely loyal. The city's location provided natural advantages that medieval European fortifications could only approximate through human engineering. The lake itself was a moat that stretched for miles in every direction, broken only by the 4 great causeways that could be severed by removing their wooden bridges. But the Spanish had something new, something the Aztecs did not. They had allies. Courts, with practiced diplomacy and ruthless leverage, had turned several neighboring peoples against the Mexica. The most important were the Tlaxcalans, whose hatred of Aztec domination had been nurtured through generations of warfare and resistance. But they were joined by others, the Totonacs from the coast, who had been among the first to ally with the Spanish. City-states around Lake Texcoco itself, whose rulers calculated that the changing balance of power offered opportunities for advancement. And individual nobles from throughout the empire, who saw Spanish victory as inevitable and positioned themselves accordingly. With their help, the Spanish forces grew. What had begun as an expedition of 600 men became an army of thousands, then tens of thousands. Indigenous warriors provided not just numbers but crucial knowledge of local geography, weather patterns, and the complex political relationships that could be manipulated to Spanish advantage. They knew which communities might be turned against the Aztecs, which routes could be used to move supplies, and which seasonal patterns could be exploited to maximize pressure on the besieged city. And so began a strangulation, not just a siege. The Spanish strategy evolved over the months of fighting, adapting European siege techniques to the unique challenges presented by a city built on water. They established bases on the mainland around the lake, creating a network of fortified positions that could control access to the causeways. They built boats, brigantines constructed from timber cut in the mountains and carried piece by piece to the lakeshore, where Spanish shipbuilders assembled them under the protection of allied warriors. These brigantines represented a technological fusion of European shipbuilding knowledge and local materials and labor. Designed as shallow draft warships, capable of operating in the lake's relatively calm waters, they carried small cannons and provided platforms for arquebusiers and crossbowmen. More importantly, they gave the Spanish control over the water, breaking the centuries-old Aztec monopoly on lake transportation. For weeks, then months, the causeways became battlegrounds. Each of the four great causeways, Tepeyac to the north, Tlacopan to the west, Iztapalapa to the south, and Coyoacán to the southwest, became the scene of daily fighting as Spanish and allied forces attempted to advance toward the city center, while Aztec defenders fought to hold every foot of ground. The fighting was unlike anything the Spanish had experienced in their European wars, or even in their conquest of Caribbean islands. Aztec tactics adapted quickly to Spanish weapons, exploiting the fact that arquebuses and crossbows required time to reload, and that horses, however terrifying they might initially appear, could be killed like any other animal. Aztec warriors learned to target Spanish horses first, recognizing that dismounted conquistadors were far more vulnerable. They developed techniques for fighting in the shallow water beside the causeways, using canoes for mobility, while Spanish forces were constrained to fight on narrow stone roadways. The Spanish brought brigantines, small warships built on the lake itself, to cut off supplies. These vessels, 13 in total, patrolled the lake like floating fortresses, interdicting the canoe traffic that had fed Tenochtitlan for centuries. The psychological effect was as important as the practical one. For generations, the lake had been Aztec domain, controlled by paddlers who knew every current and shallow, every seasonal variation in water level. Now Spanish cannons commanded those same waters, their thunder echoing off the surrounding mountains like the voices of angry gods. Starvation crept in like a slow poison. The Chinampas, the floating gardens that had made Tenochtitlan one of the most densely populated cities in the world, fell under Spanish control one by one. These artificial islands, constructed over generations from layers of mud and vegetation, had provided fresh vegetables, flowers, and medicinal plants for the urban population. As Spanish and allied forces occupied them, the complex agricultural system that supported the city began to collapse. Disease spread quickly, smallpox most of all, its invisible path cutting deeper than any sword. European diseases found virgin territory in indigenous populations with no previous exposure and therefore no inherited resistance. Smallpox, typhus, measles, and other infections swept through the crowded city, killing not just through their immediate effects, but by weakening the population's ability to resist other diseases, to fight effectively, and to maintain the complex social organization that siege conditions demanded. The epidemic dimension of the conquest has often been underestimated in popular accounts focused on military action and individual heroism or villainy. But contemporary sources, both Spanish and indigenous, describe the devastating impact of disease on the siege's outcome. Entire families died within days of each other. Skilled craftsmen who might have repaired weapons or fortifications succumbed to fevers. Priests who maintained the rituals that held communities together fell silent. The social fabric that had made resistance possible began to unravel under the pressure of mortality that no human planning could have anticipated or prevented. Inside the city, water grew scarce. The aqueducts that had brought fresh water from the springs of Chapultepec were cut by Spanish forces early in the siege, forcing the city's inhabitants to rely on rainwater collection and the dubious expedient of drinking from the lake itself. But Lake Texcoco was saline, its water unfit for human consumption, except in the most desperate circumstances. The lack of fresh water compounded the effects of disease and malnutrition, creating a downward spiral of weakness and desperation. Food ran out as the siege tightened. The great market of Tlatelolco, once a wonder that had amazed Spanish visitors with its abundance and variety, became a place where people traded family heirlooms for handfuls of grain. The tribute system that had brought exotic foods from across the empire collapsed, leaving the city dependent on whatever could be grown in the few remaining chinampas, or caught from the lake itself. Children cried in corners, while their parents searched desperately for anything edible. Tree bark was stripped and boiled. Leather was softened and chewed. The dogs that had been prized possessions and occasional ceremonial foods were slaughtered for their meat. Even rats and insects became precious sources of protein as traditional food sources disappeared. Priests pleaded with the gods through increasingly elaborate rituals, seeking divine intervention in a situation that seemed to demand supernatural aid. The captured Spanish and allied prisoners were sacrificed with a special ceremony, their hearts offered to Huitzilopochtli in hopes that the god of war would turn the tide of battle. But the gods seemed to have withdrawn their favor, or perhaps the cosmic order itself was changing in ways that human understanding could not encompass. Still, resistance continued. The defense of Tenochtitlán represents one of the most determined and sophisticated resistance efforts in the history of conquest. Despite overwhelming disadvantages in technology, despite the collapse of their tribute empire, despite disease and starvation, and the gradual loss of their allies, the Aztec defenders fought with a skill and tenacity that impressed even their enemies. Under the leadership of Cuauhtémoc, the young emperor who had succeeded Moctezuma, after the latter's death during the siege, the city's defense adapted to changing circumstances with remarkable flexibility. Cuauhtémoc, whose name meant falling eagle, had been trained as a warrior prince, and his military leadership provided the kind of coherent strategy that the crisis demanded. The defenders learned to use the city's unique geography to maximum advantage, turning every canal into a potential ambush site, every rooftop into an archery position, every plaza into a killing ground for Spanish cavalry. They developed new tactics specifically designed to counter Spanish technological advantages, using the narrow streets to negate the effectiveness of horses, creating obstacles that forced Spanish forces to fight on foot where indigenous weapons could be more effective. Courts advanced slowly, street by street, canal by canal. Every inch was contested. His soldiers described the resistance as unrelenting, a constant pressure that wore down even the most experienced veterans. The Spanish had to fight not just for territory, but for the right to hold that territory. As Aztec counterattacks constantly threatened to recapture ground that had been won at great cost. The Aztecs destroyed bridges behind them, forcing Spanish engineers to rebuild passageways under constant attack. They ambushed Spanish patrols in the maze-like residential districts, where local knowledge provided decisive advantages. They used the canals for surprise attacks, with warriors emerging from the water like vengeful spirits to strike at Spanish forces before disappearing again into the urban waterways. They fought with atlatls, spear throwers that could drive obsidian-pointed darts through Spanish armor at close range. They fought with slings that hurled stones with bone-crushing force, weapons that required no reload time and could be used by fighters too young or too old for close combat. They fought with sharpened obsidian, volcanic glass, napped at edges sharper than the finest steel, mounted on wooden clubs that could shatter Spanish swords while inflicting wounds that would not easily heal. They fought with ceremony and with desperation, maintaining the ritual forms that connected their resistance to cosmic purposes even as their city crumbled around them. War was not merely a political or economic activity in Aztec culture, but a sacred duty, a way of feeding the gods with the blood that maintained universal order. Even facing defeat, the defenders maintained the ceremonial aspects of warfare that gave their struggle meaning beyond mere survival. But the walls were closing in. By August 1521, after nearly 3 months of siege, Tenochtitlan could hold no longer. The final assaults shattered the last defenses, as Spanish and allied forces overwhelmed the remaining strongholds through sheer weight of numbers and the accumulated effects of months of attrition. Fires smoldered across districts where defenders had burned buildings rather than leave them intact for their enemies. Homes collapsed as their wooden supports, weakened by the removal of materials for defensive works, could no longer bear their loads. The end came not in a single climactic battle, but in a series of smaller collapses as different sections of the city fell to attackers who had learned from months of urban warfare. Spanish accounts describe the final assault as chaotic and brutal, with discipline breaking down as soldiers sought to claim their share of the wealth they had fought so long to obtain. Eventually, the palace itself was breached. The sacred precinct that had been the heart of Aztec power, the cosmic center for which divine authority radiated throughout the empire, fell to foreign warriors who saw only buildings to be looted and enemies to be killed. The great temple pyramid, where generations of priests had maintained the rituals that kept the world in balance, became just another military objective to be captured and held. Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, was captured while trying to flee across the lake in a canoe, perhaps hoping to reach allies who might continue the resistance from other cities around the lake or in the mountains beyond Spanish reach. He was brought before courts, proud even in defeat, his bearing that of a ruler even in chains. According to later accounts, he asked the Spaniard to take the knife and end his life with honor, requesting the warrior's death that would ensure his proper passage to the afterlife. Courts refused, whether from mercy, politics, or the hope that a living emperor might be useful for controlling his former subjects. But Tenochtitlan, as it had been, ceased to exist. The city did not simply fall, it was dismantled. The systematic destruction of Tenochtitlan began even before the fighting ended, as Spanish forces sought to eliminate the physical foundations of Aztec power. The Great Temple Pyramid, symbol of the cosmic order that had legitimized Mexico rule, was torn down stone by stone. The palaces where generations of emperors had held court were stripped of their decorations and converted to Spanish purposes or demolished entirely. Stones from the temples were repurposed for Spanish construction projects, their sacred significance transformed into mere building material for churches and government buildings. The irony was deliberate. Spanish authorities wanted the physical substance of Aztec power to become the foundation for colonial authority, a visible demonstration that the old gods had fallen and new powers had taken their place. The canals were filled, their complex engineering ignored in favor of European urban planning that emphasized straight streets and central plazas. suitable for Spanish administrative and commercial needs. The floating gardens, those marvels of agricultural engineering that had fed the city for centuries, were abandoned or converted to Spanish-style agriculture that emphasized different crops and different relationships between urban and rural spaces. The old gods were pulled down, their statues broken and buried, their shrines converted or destroyed. Spanish priests, following procedures developed during the Reconquista, methodically eliminated the physical traces of indigenous religion while attempting to convert the population to Christianity. But this was not simply a matter of replacing one set of beliefs with another. It involved transforming entire ways of understanding the relationship between human beings and the cosmos, between community and individual, between this world and the supernatural realm. A new city was built atop the ruins, called Mexico City. Spanish colonial architecture, with its emphasis on courtyards and arcades, its use of European decorative motifs, and its orientation around central plazas suitable for Spanish civic and religious ceremonies, gradually obscured the traces of what had come before. Streets were laid out in the geometric grid patterns familiar from Spanish cities, ignoring the organic relationship between urban form and natural environment that had characterized Tenochtitlan. But beneath the stone, the memory lingers. The transformation of Tenochtitlan into Mexico City was never complete. Spanish colonial authorities, despite their systematic efforts to eliminate indigenous culture, could not entirely erase the deeper patterns that connected people to place. The lake might be drained, the canals filled, the temples demolished, but the cultural memory of what had been lost persisted in stories, in dreams, in the unconscious knowledge that passes from generation to generation, like water seeping through stone. If you walk those streets today, you may not see the lake, or the temples, or the flower-filled chinampas. But they are there, quietly waiting beneath your feet, just beyond the layers of time. The modern city sits uneasily on its ancient foundations, as if the weight of history were still settling, still seeking a balance that was disrupted 5 centuries ago. The subway construction of recent decades has repeatedly uncovered Aztec ruins, reminders that the indigenous city exists parallel to the colonial and modern ones, occupying the same space in a different time. Construction workers have learned to expect discoveries. Carved serpent heads emerging from foundation excavations, obsidian blades scattered in the soil, fragments of painted murals that once decorated palace walls. But while the Spanish built atop what they could see, much was left hidden. Beneath the modern city, the earth still holds secrets. Altars buried under pavement, their carved faces still bearing traces of the blood and copal incense that once sanctified them. Offerings sealed beneath layers of stone, ceramic vessels containing precious stones and gold ornaments placed there by priests, who hoped the gods would remember their devotion, even after the temples fell. Stories never written, only carved in basalt or painted in fading murals, wait in the darkness beneath the city streets. They speak of a world where human beings lived in daily communion with gods who walked among them, where the boundaries between natural and supernatural were permeable, where every act had cosmic significance and every individual participated in the great work of maintaining universal order. The Spanish chroniclers recorded what they could understand of Aztec culture. Their accounts were inevitably filtered through European categories of thought, translated into concepts that made sense within Christian cosmology and Spanish political theory. What they could not understand, they often dismissed as devil worship or primitive superstition, missing the sophisticated philosophical and theological systems that had guided one of the world's most complex urban civilizations. But the stones remember what the written records forgot. In the foundations of Mexico City, in the basalt blocks reused for colonial construction, in the obsidian fragments scattered through the archaeological layers, the material culture of Tenochtitlan persists. These objects carry information that no Spanish chronicler recorded, the techniques used by craftsmen whose guilds disappeared with the conquest, the aesthetic principles that guided artists whose work was condemned as pagan, the mathematical and astronomical knowledge that was preserved in objects rather than in the bark paper books that Spanish priests burned as works of the devil. The conquest was not merely a military victory, but a collision of worlds so fundamentally different that neither side could fully comprehend what the other represented. In the months leading up to the siege, both Spanish and Aztec societies had to confront the limits of their own understanding, forced to adapt categories of thought that had served them for centuries to circumstances that no previous generation had faced. For the Spanish, the encounter with Tenochtitlan challenged every assumption about civilization and barbarism that had guided their expansion across the Atlantic. Here was a city larger than Madrid or Seville, with engineering more sophisticated than anything they had seen in Europe, yet built by people they had been taught to consider primitive. The cognitive dissonance was profound and lasting, creating contradictions in Spanish colonial policy that would persist for generations. The encomienda system that the Spanish imposed on conquered territories assumed that indigenous peoples were essentially children who needed European guidance to become civilized Christians. But how could this assumption be reconciled with the evidence of Aztec astronomical observations that surpassed European accuracy, or with architectural achievements that European engineers could barely comprehend, much less replicate? The Spanish solution was to separate technological and artistic achievement from moral and spiritual development, arguing that indigenous peoples might be skilled craftsmen but remain spiritual children in need of Christian salvation. This rationalization allowed Spanish colonizers to appropriate indigenous knowledge while maintaining their sense of cultural superiority, but it also created a profound blindness to the philosophical and spiritual sophistication of the societies they were destroying. The Aztec understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear, their concept of sacrifice as cosmic necessity rather than mere brutality, their vision of human beings as partners with the gods in maintaining universal order. These ideas were so foreign to European thought that most Spanish observers could only interpret them as devil worship or primitive superstition. Meanwhile, Aztec society struggled to understand visitors whose motivations seemed to defy every principle of civilized behavior. European individualism, the idea that personal gain could justify actions that harmed the community, was almost incomprehensible to people raised in a culture where identity was collective and where personal advancement was always understood in terms of service to the larger social and cosmic order. The Spanish obsession with gold puzzled Aztec observers who valued the metal for its symbolic associations with the sun god rather than as a store of wealth. In Aztec society, the most precious materials were those that required the greatest skill to work. The feathers of tropical birds that had to be gathered from distant lands and arranged by master craftsmen. The obsidian blades that demanded expertise passed down through generations of specialized families. The jade carvings that represented not just artistic achievement, but spiritual insight. Gold was valuable, but it was not the ultimate measure of worth that it had become in European society. The Spanish hunger for precious metals seemed to the Aztecs like a form of spiritual sickness, a confusion of symbol for substance that revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how value was created and maintained in civilized society. The role of warfare in the two cultures also created profound misunderstandings that contributed to the catastrophic breakdown of initial diplomatic relations. For the Aztecs, war was ritual activity, governed by complex rules that limited its destructive potential and integrated it into the larger cosmic order. Warriors sought to capture enemies rather than kill them, because live prisoners could be sacrificed in ceremonies that fed the gods and maintained the balance between human and divine realms. European warfare, by contrast, aimed at the complete destruction of enemy capacity to resist. The Spanish had been shaped by centuries of total war against Muslim kingdoms in Iberia, conflicts where religious difference justified the most extreme measures and where civilian populations were legitimate targets. when they applied these methods to their conflict with the Aztecs. The result was a level of destruction that indigenous societies had never experienced. The massacre during the Tenochtitlan festival exemplified this cultural collision. For the Spanish, the ceremony appeared to be a gathering of potential enemies who might at any moment turn against them. Their preemptive strike followed European military logic that emphasized the elimination of threats before they could develop. For the Aztecs, the attack on unarmed celebrants during a sacred ceremony violated every principle of civilized warfare, revealing the Spanish as barbarians who recognized no boundaries between sacred and profane, between civilian and military, between the permissible and the unthinkable. These cultural misunderstandings were not merely academic differences, but practical obstacles that made peaceful coexistence impossible. Each side interpreted the other's actions through their own cultural framework, creating a spiral of misunderstanding and retaliation that eventually made war inevitable. The siege itself revealed the adaptive capacity of both cultures under extreme pressure. The Spanish quickly learned that European siege techniques had to be modified for the unique challenges presented by a city built on water. They developed new tactics that combined European military engineering with indigenous knowledge of local conditions, creating hybrid approaches that were neither purely European nor purely indigenous, but something entirely new. Aztec defenders, meanwhile, showed remarkable flexibility in adapting their traditional military practices to counter Spanish technological advantages. They learned to coordinate attacks on Spanish cavalry, developed new applications for traditional weapons, and created defensive strategies that maximized the advantages provided by their urban environment. The introduction of smallpox and other European diseases into the siege created another layer of complexity that neither side fully understood at the time. The Spanish knew that disease was devastating their enemies, but they did not understand the mechanism by which this was happening. They interpreted the epidemic as divine intervention, proof that God favored their cause and condemned their enemies. The Aztecs, facing diseases for which they had no effective treatments and no cultural framework for understanding, struggled to maintain the social organization that effective resistance required. Traditional healing practices, which had served them well for centuries, proved useless against pathogens that their immune systems had never encountered. The breakdown of normal social relationships under the pressure of mass mortality created chaos that was often more damaging than direct military action. Children orphaned by disease had no one to teach them the specialized knowledge required for urban survival. Craftsmen who died before passing their skills to apprentices took irreplaceable knowledge to their graves. Priests who succumbed to fever could no longer perform the rituals that maintained community cohesion and morale. The epidemic dimension of the conquest destroyed not just loves, but the cultural transmission systems that had preserved Aztec civilization for centuries. The final months of the siege saw both sides pushed to extremes that revealed the fundamental character of their respective societies. The Spanish, sensing victory, became increasingly brutal in their treatment of both enemies and allies. Accounts of the final assault described soldiers who had lost all discipline, killing indiscriminately, and looting with a frenzy that shocked even their own commanders. But this brutalization was not merely the result of months of warfare. It reflected deeper aspects of Spanish colonial culture that would shape the next 3 centuries of Mexican history. The encomienda system, the racial hierarchies that Spanish colonialism imposed, the extraction economy that treated indigenous labor and natural resources as inputs for European enrichment. All of these were prefigured in the behavior of Spanish soldiers during the final assault on Tenochtitlan. The Aztec response to impending defeat revealed different values. Even facing starvation and disease, even knowing that resistance was futile, the defenders maintained the ceremonial aspects of warfare that connected their struggle to cosmic purposes. They continued to take prisoners for sacrifice, continued to perform the rituals that gave meaning to their resistance, continued to fight with a dignity that impressed even their enemies. This was not mere stubbornness, but a different understanding of what defeat meant and how it should be faced. In Aztec cosmology, the fifth sun would eventually end, destroyed by earthquakes when the gods tired of human imperfection. Perhaps the conquest was simply the beginning of that cosmic transformation, the first tremor in the foundation of the world. If so, then human duty was not to prevent the inevitable, but to face it with the courage and ceremony that would ensure proper passage to whatever came next. The execution of prisoners, which Spanish sources describe as evidence of Aztec cruelty, served different purposes in indigenous understanding. These sacrifices were offerings to the gods, attempts to maintain cosmic balance even as the human world collapsed. The Spanish, interpreting these actions through European categories, saw only barbarity where Aztecs saw religious duty. After the fall of the city, the process of cultural transformation began immediately but proceeded unevenly, creating layers of meaning that accumulated over the following centuries. Spanish colonial authorities faced the enormous task of governing millions of indigenous people whose languages, customs, and worldviews remained largely foreign to them. The solution was a kind of cultural apartheid that preserved indigenous communities while subordinating them to Spanish authority and Christian doctrine. This system created opportunities for cultural survival that the complete destruction of indigenous society might not have allowed. In remote villages and the margins of Spanish attention, old practices continued under new names. The goddess Tonantzin became the Virgin of Guadalupe, but her shrine remained on the same hill where Aztec pilgrims had worshipped for centuries. Traditional healers became curanderos, preserving indigenous medical knowledge within nominally Christian frameworks. But survival came at enormous cost. The demographic collapse that followed the conquest reduced the indigenous population of Central Mexico by perhaps 90% over the course of a century. Entire languages disappeared as their last speakers died without passing their knowledge to the next generation. Art forms that had flourished for centuries vanished as the social contexts that supported them were destroyed. The Spanish built their new city according to European urban planning principles, but they could not entirely escape the influence of the environment they had inherited. The lake, though gradually drained, continued to shape patterns of settlement and movement. The annual flooding that had been controlled by Aztec dikes and canals became a persistent problem for Spanish engineers, who struggled to master hydraulic techniques that their predecessors had perfected centuries earlier. Indigenous laborers who built the colonial city brought their own knowledge and aesthetic sensibilities to the work, creating a hybrid architectural style that was neither purely European nor purely indigenous. Churches decorated with indigenous motifs, government buildings that incorporated traditional construction techniques, private residences that adapted European forms to local climate, and materials. Colonial Mexico City became a palimpsest of cultural influences layered one atop another. The psychological dimension of this transformation was equally complex. Spanish colonizers lived with the constant awareness that they were a small minority, ruling over vast numbers of people whose loyalty could never be taken for granted. This awareness shaped colonial institutions, legal systems, and social relationships in ways that persisted long after the demographic balance shifted in favor of mixed-race populations. Indigenous survivors, meanwhile, carried the memory of what had been lost, passing stories from generation to generation that preserved not just historical information, but entire ways of understanding the relationship between human beings and the natural world. These memories were dangerous in a colonial context that demanded acceptance of Spanish authority and Christian doctrine, so they were often disguised as folklore, embedded in religious festivals, or preserved in artistic traditions that seemed harmless to colonial authorities. The result was a kind of cultural guerrilla warfare that continued for centuries, a quiet resistance that preserved indigenous knowledge and values within the framework of colonial society. This resistance was not organized or coordinated, but it was persistent and effective, ensuring that indigenous influences would continue to shape Mexican culture long after the political structures of Aztec society had been destroyed. Let's travel now into those hidden spaces, where archaeologists peel back time layer by careful layer, and where the foundations of Tenochtitlan still whisper their secrets to those who know how to listen. We begin our descent into the Great Temple, that cosmic mountain built by human hands, where the boundaries between earth and sky, between human and divine, between the world of the living and the realm of the gods, were thinnest. Here, in the darkness beneath the modern city, the real conquest story begins to emerge from the shadows, where it has waited for 500 years to be told. Imagine yourself standing on a quiet street in the heart of Mexico City. The air is warm, and the faint sound of traffic hums somewhere in the distance. But beneath the pavement, the concrete, and the towering colonial architecture, something older waits. Beneath the foundations of the modern world lies a buried memory, one built not just of stone, but of reverence and repetition. The Templo Mayor, the great temple of Tenochtitlan, still slumbers below the city's surface, its walls fragmented but not forgotten. It wasn't always hidden. In its time, the Templo Mayor stood at the very center of Tenochtitlan. It was more than a temple. It was a cosmic anchor where the heavens, earth, and underworld met. From its summit, priests looked out over the city and sky. Its two shrines, side by side, honored two opposing but intertwined gods: Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. The duality mattered. Life and death, sun and water, war and harvest. The temple rose in tiers, each layer built atop the last, over generations. It was not static. It was alive in time, expanding and reshaping with the needs and triumphs of the empire. To understand the Templo Mayor is to understand how the Aztecs conceived of space itself. Every measurement was deliberate, every angle calculated not just for structural integrity, but for cosmic alignment. The temple faced west, toward the setting sun, toward the realm where Huitzilopochtli battled darkness each night to ensure dawn would come again. The positioning was not arbitrary. It was an act of participation in the fundamental struggle that kept the universe in motion. The base of the temple stretched across nearly 400 feet on each side, rising in graduated platforms that lifted the twin shrines 150 feet into the air. But these numbers tell only part of the story. What they cannot convey is how the structure seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the city around it. How its surfaces caught the light at different times of day. How shadows moved across its steps like sundials, marking not just hours, but seasons, years, entire cycles of cosmic time. The temple was never finished, never complete in the way we might think of completion. Each generation added to it, built upon it, expanded it outward and upward. Archaeological evidence suggests that major renovations occurred roughly every 52 years, coinciding with the Aztec calendar's most significant cycle. This was not maintenance or repair. This was renewal, transformation, a way of ensuring that the sacred center of their world remained vital and responsive to changing times. The stonework itself tells stories. Massive blocks of volcanic rock, some weighing several tons, were quarried from sites dozens of miles away and transported to Tenochtitlan without wheels or pack animals. The logistics alone required unprecedented coordination. Teams of workers carried stones along carefully maintained causeways, through canals on specialized canoes, up ramps and scaffolding systems that may have taken months to construct for a single building phase. But the true marvel was not in the transport, but in the precision of placement. Stones were fitted together so tightly that mortar became almost unnecessary. Corners aligned with mathematical exactitude. Drainage systems channeled rainwater through hidden conduits that prevented erosion while directing sacred flows toward specific collection points. The builders understood that they were creating not just architecture, but a living system that would interact with wind, water, sunlight, and time itself. The twin shrines at the summit embodied the Aztec understanding of necessary opposition. Huitzilopochtli's shrine, painted in bright red and decorated with symbols of warfare and solar power, stood as a monument to the active principle that drove expansion and conquest. Here, captured warriors were sacrificed at dawn, their hearts offered to ensure the sun's daily victory over darkness. The rituals were elaborate, choreographed with precision that matched the temple's architecture. Tlaloc's shrine, painted in blue and white, honored the receptive principle that brought rain and fertility. Here, children were sometimes sacrificed during drought seasons, their tears believed to call forth the rains that would save crops and sustain life. The ceremonies were different, but equally elaborate, involving complex processions, music, and offerings that could last for days. These were not separate traditions, but complementary aspects of a single worldview. War and agriculture, expansion and cultivation, destruction and creation were understood as interconnected forces that required careful balance. The temple's dual nature reflected this understanding in stone and ritual, making visible the invisible tensions that the Aztecs believed governed all existence. After the conquest, the Spanish dismantled it, brick by brick, using its stones to build their own cathedral. What they couldn't carry, they buried. And for centuries, the great temple disappeared beneath layers of earth, forgotten by many, remembered by some. The process of dismantling was as systematic as the original construction had been. Spanish chroniclers describe organized crews working for months to reduce the Great Pyramid to rubble. Stones were sorted by size and quality. The finest carved blocks were reserved for the cathedral's foundation. Smaller stones became cobblestones for streets. Decorative elements were either destroyed as pagan idolatry or ground into lime for mortar. But the Spanish could not unmake what the temple had been. They could scatter its stones, but they could not scatter its meaning. Indigenous workers, forced to participate in the demolition, found ways to preserve what they could. Some ritual objects were hidden in walls of new buildings. Some carved stones were incorporated into colonial structures, with their sacred faces turned inward, invisible but present. Some priests and nobles managed to relocate smaller shrines to hidden locations outside the city. The burial was as much about forgetting as it was about building. Each layer of earth thrown over the ruins was meant to sever connections with the past, to make the new order seem inevitable and permanent. Colonial authorities understood that architecture shapes memory, that people derive identity from the spaces they inhabit. By erasing the temple, they hoped to erase the culture that had created it. Yet something persisted. Indigenous communities preserved oral traditions that kept alive not just the memory of the temple, but detailed knowledge of its layout, its purposes, its sacred calendar. Spanish colonial documents, written by indigenous scribes, contain careful descriptions of ceremonies, architectural details, and ritual procedures that would prove invaluable centuries later when archaeologists began their work. The city grew above the buried temple. Generation after generation lived and worked over the ruins without knowing what lay beneath their feet. Streets were laid out following Spanish colonial patterns that deliberately obscured the indigenous city's organization. Buildings rose and fell, were replaced and renovated, creating layer upon layer of urban palimpsest. Then, in 1978, something changed. A crew working in the city's center struck something unexpected while digging a trench. It was a large circular stone carved with the image of Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess. Her myth is complex, but at its heart lies a story of betrayal, dismemberment, and cosmic balance. Her image marked the beginning of something remarkable. The discovery was almost accidental, but its implications were immediately clear to anyone who understood Aztec mythology. According to legend, Coyolxauhqui was killed and dismembered by her brother, Huitzilopochtli, in a cosmic battle that established the current order of the universe. Her body was thrown from a mountain, and in the myth, This mountain was represented by the Templo Mayor itself. To find her carved image was to locate the exact spot where the temple's main staircase had been. The stone itself is a masterpiece of Aztec sculpture. Nearly 11 feet in diameter, it depicts the goddess with her head severed, her limbs scattered, her body adorned with symbols that speak to lunar cycles, feminine power, and the necessary violence that maintains cosmic order. Every detail was carefully planned and executed. The proportions follow mathematical relationships that appear throughout Aztec art and architecture. The symbolic elements are arranged according to directional principles that encode complex theological concepts. But beyond its artistic merit, the Koyolzoki stone served as a map. Its position and orientation provided archaeologists with precise information about how the temple had been laid out, which direction it faced, where its major features had been located. It was like finding the cornerstone of a building that had been demolished centuries ago. Excavations began slowly, carefully, as layers of modern life were peeled back to reveal ancient paths. The archaeologists worked in quiet reverence, knowing that each step downward was also a step backward through time. The work required extraordinary patience and precision. Each layer of earth had to be photographed, measured, and documented before removal. Modern utilities, sewer lines, foundations, and basements had to be worked around or temporarily relocated. The excavation site was in the heart of one of the world's largest cities, surrounded by traffic, commerce, and millions of people going about their daily lives. The archaeologists developed techniques specifically for urban excavation. They created detailed grid systems to track the location of every artifact. They used fine brushes and dental tools to clean delicate carvings. They employed photographers, artists, and computer specialists to document discoveries in multiple formats. Each day's work was recorded, not just in field notes, but in detailed drawings, measurements, and photographic sequences. As the excavation progressed, the true scope of the temple began to emerge. What had seemed like a single structure was revealed to be a complex of buildings, plazas, and ceremonial spaces that covered several city blocks. There were smaller temples, priestly residences, schools for noble children, workshops where ritual objects were manufactured, storage facilities for tribute goods, and administrative buildings where the empire's business was conducted. They uncovered altars, staircases, and ritual platforms. Offerings were found, still resting where they had been placed hundreds of years before. There were obsidian knives, delicate shells brought from far coasts, twisted bundles of human hair, and jaguar bones. Each offering had a meaning, though not all meanings are understood today. The offering caches were perhaps the most revealing discoveries. These were deliberate deposits, carefully arranged collections of objects that had been buried at specific locations during construction or renovation phases. Each cache seemed to follow strict rules about what could be included, how objects should be arranged, and where they should be placed within the temple complex. Some offerings contained hundreds of individual items. Seashells from both the Pacific and Atlantic coasts, indicating trade networks that spanned the continent. Obsidian blades knapped with such skill that they remained sharper than modern surgical instruments. Jade ornaments carved into intricate representations of gods, animals, and geometric patterns. Coral, amber, and precious stones from regions hundreds of miles away. But it was not just the exotic materials that impressed archaeologists. The offerings also contained everyday objects transformed by the ritual context. Simple pottery vessels, bone needles, textile fragments, and wooden tools had been carefully selected and arranged with the same attention given to precious stones and metals. The message seemed to be that sacredness was not inherent in materials, but created through intention and proper placement. Some of the most intriguing offerings contained what appeared to be sets or collections. 20 obsidian knives arranged in a specific pattern, 40 ceramic vessels, each containing different materials, groups of shell ornaments that seemed to represent constellations or calendar systems. These patterns suggested that the offerings were not random gifts to the gods, but carefully composed messages, perhaps encoding information about dates, ceremonies, or theological concepts. The preservation of organic materials was remarkable. In some offering caches, archaeologists found feathers still retaining their original colors, wooden objects with their carved details intact, textile fragments showing sophisticated weaving techniques and dye processes. The alkaline soil conditions and the sealed context of the caches had created perfect preservation environments. Perhaps the most striking discovery was not any one item, but the realization that the temple was a palimpsest. Beneath one layer lay another, and beneath that, another still. At least 7 major phases of construction have been uncovered so far, like rings inside a tree, each speaking to the time that built it. Each construction phase told a story about the empire's growth and changing needs. The earliest levels were smaller, simpler, built when Tenochtitlan was still a relatively modest city-state among many in the Valley of Mexico. As Aztec power expanded, so did their temple. New conquests brought new tribute, which funded larger and more elaborate construction projects. The architectural evolution was not random, but followed clear patterns. Each new phase incorporated elements from the previous one, while adding innovations that reflected changing aesthetic preferences, improved engineering techniques, and expanded theological understanding. Stairways were widened to accommodate larger processions. Shrine platforms were elevated to make ceremonies visible from greater distances. Drainage systems were improved to handle the runoff from larger structures. But the changes went deeper than mere expansion. The iconographic program evolved as well. Early phases emphasized local deities and regional mythologies. Later phases incorporated gods and symbols from conquered territories, creating a visual synthesis that reflected the empire's cultural complexity. The temple became a kind of 3-dimensional map of Aztec expansion, with each level encoding information about when and how different regions had been incorporated into the empire. The stratigraphy also revealed evidence of destruction and renewal that had nothing to do with Spanish conquest. Several construction phases showed signs of deliberate dismantling, suggesting that the Aztecs themselves had periodically torn down and rebuilt portions of the temple complex. This was not destruction, but transformation, part of calendrical cycles that required periodic renewal of sacred spaces. Fire damage was evident in several levels, but rather than being seen as disasters, these episodes seemed to have been incorporated into the temple's symbolic program. Burned areas were sometimes left visible in new construction phases, perhaps representing controlled destruction that made new creation possible. The Aztecs understood that regeneration required destruction, that the new could only emerge from the ashes of the old. And always, at the center of it all, is the intention, the rhythm, the ritual. Even in ruin, the Templo Mayor speaks softly. The stone steps are worn from centuries of feet. The carvings have faded, but not vanished. The walls that remain still face the cardinal directions, still tied to the movement of the sun, the moon, and the stars. The astronomical alignments remain precise, despite centuries of Earth movement and urban development. The temple's main axis aligns with the point on the horizon where the sun sets during the equinoxes. Secondary alignments mark the positions of various stars and constellations that were important in Aztec calendar systems. These were not coincidental, but represented sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles and their relationship to agricultural and ceremonial schedules. Modern instruments have confirmed what indigenous knowledge had always maintained. The temple was designed as a kind of cosmic observatory, a place where earthly ceremonies could be synchronized with celestial events. The height and orientation of different platforms created sightlines that allowed priests to track the movements of Venus, the Pleiades, and other astronomical markers with remarkable accuracy. The acoustic properties of the ruins also suggest intentional design. Despite centuries of damage, certain areas still exhibit unusual sound characteristics. Whispers spoken at one end of a platform can be heard clearly at the other end. Clapping hands produces distinct echo patterns that seem to mimic animal sounds. These effects were likely much more pronounced when the structures were complete and may have been used to enhance the theatrical aspects of ceremonies. Above ground, the Templo Mayor Museum now houses many of these relics. It is quiet there, cool and softly lit. Each object rests behind glass, but not beyond understanding. A bowl shaped like a frog, used in water rituals. A mask of turquoise mosaic. A flute that still carries breath when played. These are not just artifacts. They are echoes. The museum's design acknowledges the sacred nature of the objects it contains. The building itself incorporates architectural elements that reference pre-Columbian design principles. Natural lighting is used whenever possible, creating subtle changes in illumination that echo the ways these objects would have been seen in their original contexts. The display cases are arranged to suggest ritual relationships between objects rather than merely chronological or typological sequences. Visiting the museum is a meditation on time and meaning. Many of the objects were created by artists whose names we will never know, whose individual stories have been lost to history. Yet their work speaks across centuries with undiminished power. The skill required to create some of these pieces rivals anything produced by contemporary artists. The conceptual sophistication, evident in their symbolic programs, demonstrates intellectual achievements that challenge assumptions about pre-Columbian societies. Some objects seem almost alive, masks with inlaid eyes that seem to track visitors as they move through the galleries. Ceramic figures whose expressions change subtly, depending on viewing angle and lighting conditions. Musical instruments that seem to vibrate with potential sound, even in their silent display cases. These effects are not supernatural, but speak to the extraordinary skill of their creators and the power of art to transcend its material conditions. The museum also houses reconstruction models that help visitors understand how the temple complex would have appeared at different periods. These models, based on archaeological evidence and indigenous historical sources, reveal the temple as it was meant to be experienced, not as ruins, but as a living center of one of the world's great civilizations. What the excavations continue to show us is that the Aztec world was not lost completely. It was hidden, reshaped, and built over, but its foundation remains. The layers of soil, stone, and silence have preserved far more than once believed. Recent technological advances have revolutionized the pace and precision of discovery. Ground-penetrating radar can detect buried structures without excavation. Laser scanning creates precise three-dimensional maps of exposed surfaces. Chemical analysis can identify the sources of raw materials, revealing trade networks and technological processes. Digital photography and computer modeling allow for detailed study of objects and architectural elements that are too fragile for handling. These tools have confirmed what indigenous oral traditions had maintained for centuries. The Templo Mayor was only the most visible element of a sacred landscape that extended throughout Tenochtitlan and beyond. Smaller temples, ritual pools, ceremonial causeways, and other religious structures were distributed throughout the city according to principles that integrated urban planning with cosmological beliefs. The excavations have also revealed the extent to which Spanish colonial construction deliberately obscured indigenous urban organization. Streets were laid out to interrupt indigenous sightlines. Colonial buildings were positioned to block views of surviving pre-Columbian structures. The cathedral was built not merely on the site of the temple, but specifically to dominate and overwrite its symbolic significance. Yet the persistence of the underlying pattern is remarkable. Indigenous neighborhoods maintained their locations despite colonial attempts at reorganization. Market areas continued to operate in the same locations they had occupied before conquest. Ceremonial routes became processional paths for Catholic festivals, preserving ancient patterns of movement through urban space. In recent years, more offerings have been uncovered, some buried more than 15 feet below the cathedral square, some placed with mathematical precision, aligned to solstices and cardinal points, others arranged in ways that suggest stories long untold. The most recent discoveries have included some of the richest and most complex offering caches ever found. One chamber, discovered in 2019, contained over 15,000 individual objects, arranged in patterns that seem to encode astronomical and calendrical information. Another cache included the remains of a golden eagle dressed in miniature warrior costume, suggesting connections between military symbolism and religious practice that had not been previously understood. These new discoveries continue to challenge assumptions about Aztec society and religion. The sophistication of the symbolic programs evident in the offering arrangements suggests intellectual traditions of remarkable complexity. The mathematical precision of the alignments indicates scientific knowledge that was both practical and theoretical. The artistic quality of even the smallest objects demonstrates aesthetic standards that permeated all levels of society. Each new discovery also raises new questions. Some offering caches seem to have been disturbed and rearranged in ancient times, suggesting ongoing ritual activities that continued long after initial burial. Some objects show evidence of deliberate breakage that seems to have been part of the offering process rather than accidental damage. Some arrangements include objects that appear to be much older than their burial contexts, suggesting the preservation and reuse of heirloom items across generations. What archaeologists have found beneath Mexico City is not just a temple, but a worldview, one in which time was circular, in which sacrifice kept the world turning, and in which the gods walked closely alongside daily life. This worldview is encoded not just in the temple's architecture, but in every aspect of its material culture. The way stones were cut and fitted reflects beliefs about the relationship between human craft and natural form. The selection and arrangement of offering materials demonstrates understanding of symbolic systems that connected local objects with cosmic principles. The integration of artistic and functional elements shows how aesthetic considerations were inseparable from practical and religious concerns. The Aztec conception of time, revealed through the temple's construction sequence and offering patterns, was fundamentally different from linear Western models. Time was cyclical, repetitive, but not merely circular. Each cycle brought renewal, but also transformation. Each repetition was both return and progression. The temple embodied this understanding by growing and changing while maintaining its essential identity and purpose. The role of sacrifice in maintaining cosmic order was not merely metaphorical, but practical. The Aztecs understood their ceremonies as necessary work, as essential as agriculture or warfare for keeping the world functioning properly. The temple was the primary workplace for this cosmic maintenance, the place where human activity intersected most directly with universal processes. To walk those streets now is to walk atop memory. Every step in central Mexico City crosses multiple layers of history. Indigenous foundations support colonial walls, which support modern structures. Ancient drainage systems still channel water beneath contemporary pavement. Property boundaries sometimes follow pre-Columbian lot lines that have persisted for over 500 years. The memory is not just architectural, but cultural. Food vendors still sell items whose recipes derive from pre-Columbian traditions. Local festivals preserve ceremonial patterns that echo ancient rituals. Even Spanish colonial churches incorporated indigenous architectural elements and building techniques that connect them to deeper traditions. Street names throughout the city reference Nahuatl terms, preserving linguistic connections to the pre-Columbian past. Many neighborhoods maintain indigenous names that encode information about their original functions. Places where specific gods were worshipped, where particular crafts were practiced, where certain tribute goods were stored or processed. The geological foundation of the city also carries memory. Mexico City is built on the dried lake bed, where Tenochtitlan once rose from artificial islands. The soil conditions that preserved the temple's offering caches continue to protect countless other archaeological sites throughout the urban area. Every construction project has the potential to uncover new evidence of the indigenous past. And every time a subway is expanded or a sidewalk repaired, there is the chance that something else will rise from the earth, wrapped in soil and centuries. The Mexico City metro system has become an inadvertent archaeological survey. Virtually every line has encountered pre-Columbian remains during construction. Station exhibits display artifacts found during excavation. Route alignments have been modified to avoid disrupting significant archaeological sites. The transportation infrastructure of the modern city has become a museum of its indigenous foundations. Private construction projects regularly uncover significant finds. Homeowners digging foundations discover offering caches. Office building excavations reveal walls and floors of pre-Columbian structures. Hotel construction uncovers ancient canals and drainage systems. Each discovery requires careful documentation and often delays or modifications to construction plans. The legal framework surrounding these discoveries reflects ongoing negotiation between development needs and historical preservation. Mexican law requires archaeological assessment for any significant excavation in areas of potential historical significance. This means that much of central Mexico City operates under archaeological oversight that can halt or redirect construction at any time. But the discoveries are not inconveniences to be managed. They are opportunities to understand and connect with cultural heritage that remains vital and relevant. Each artifact provides new information about how indigenous societies organized themselves, how they understood their place in the world, how they created meaning through material culture. Not a curse, not a secret, but a quiet reminder. The persistence of indigenous culture through centuries of suppression and transformation demonstrates resilience that goes far beyond mere survival. The temple's rediscovery has coincided with broader movements to recognize and honor indigenous contributions to Mexican national identity. Archaeological findings provide concrete evidence for cultural achievements that colonialism had systematically devalued or ignored. The Templo Mayor has become a symbol not just of historical interest, but of cultural continuity. Indigenous communities throughout Mexico see its excavation and preservation as validation of traditions that they have maintained despite centuries of persecution. The museum and archaeological site have become pilgrimage destinations for people seeking connection with ancestral heritage. Contemporary Mexican identity increasingly incorporates pride in pre-Columbian achievements alongside recognition of colonial and modern contributions. The temple serves as a focal point for this integration, a place where different historical periods and cultural traditions can be understood as parts of a continuous story rather than disconnected episodes. That this city was once another city, filled with chants and firelight, and ruled by rhythms that have not been entirely silenced. The rhythms persist in ways both obvious and subtle. The timing of markets, the patterns of festivals, the organization of neighborhoods, the relationship between sacred and secular space all echo patterns established centuries before Spanish arrival. Modern Mexico City is not simply built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. It is in many ways its continuation and transformation. The chants have been replaced by different sounds, but the impulse to mark time through ceremony and celebration continues. Catholic festivals follow calendar cycles that incorporate indigenous seasonal observations. Popular music draws on rhythmic patterns that can be traced to pre-Columbian sources. Even the daily soundscape of the city, from street vendors' calls to traffic patterns, follows rhythms that echo those of its predecessor. The firelight has been replaced by electric illumination, but the understanding of light as sacred and transformative persists. Churches and public buildings use lighting to create ceremonial atmospheres that echo the torch-lit temples of the past. Festival celebrations employ candles, fireworks, and decorative lighting in patterns that reference ancient traditions of marking sacred time and space through controlled fire. We've wandered through canals and temples, through daily rituals and imperial collapse, and through the buried remnants that lie just beneath modern stone. Now let's turn our gaze upward to a different kind of life. A life removed from the dust and labor, elevated in status, but just as tightly bound to duty and expectation. The soil itself holds secrets that extend far beyond individual artifacts or architectural remains. Geological analysis of the excavation layers has revealed environmental changes that shaped the city's development over centuries. Pollen samples trapped in ancient sediments tell stories of changing vegetation patterns, of gardens and agricultural plots that once flourished where concrete now dominates. Seeds and plant fragments preserved in offering caches provide evidence of botanical knowledge that allowed the Aztecs to cultivate hundreds of plant varieties, many of which have since been lost to modern agriculture. Water played a crucial role in the temple's daily operations, and traces of this relationship persist in the archaeological record. Complex hydraulic systems channeled fresh water from distant springs through underground aqueducts that supplied the temple's ritual pools and ceremonial fountains. The engineering required to maintain consistent water pressure and flow across the city's uneven terrain rivals any contemporary water management system. The temple's relationship with water extended beyond practical concerns to profound spiritual significance. Water was not merely a resource, but a living force that connected earthly ceremonies with cosmic cycles. Ritual purification required specific types of water collected from sacred sources at particular times. Some ceremonies demanded rainwater caught during storms. Others required water drawn from deep cenotes or mountain springs. The temple's water management system was designed to collect, store, and distribute these various sacred waters according to ceremonial needs. Archaeological evidence suggests that the temple complex included sophisticated workshops where ritual objects were manufactured by specialized craftsmen. These artisans possessed technical skills that modern researchers are still working to understand fully. Obsidian knappers could create blades thinner than modern razor edges. Feather workers created mosaics so intricate that individual barbules were manipulated to create subtle color gradations. Goldsmiths developed alloys and casting techniques that produced objects of extraordinary beauty and durability. These workshops were not merely production facilities, but centers of knowledge transmission where master craftsmen trained apprentices in techniques that required years to master. The quality control evident in temple artifacts suggests rigorous standards that went far beyond functional requirements. Even objects that would be buried immediately after creation were finished with the same attention to detail as those intended for public display. The economic networks that supplied the temple extended throughout Mesoamerica and beyond. Trade relationships brought materials from regions as distant as present-day Honduras and New Mexico. Cacao beans from tropical lowlands, turquoise from northern deserts, obsidian from volcanic highlands, and shells from both Pacific and Atlantic coasts all found their way into temple offerings through complex exchange systems that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. These networks were not merely commercial, but carried cultural and religious significance. Traders were often also diplomats, carrying messages and negotiating relationships between distant communities. The objects they transported were valued not only for their material properties, but for their origins, their connections to specific places and peoples that gave them additional layers of meaning within ritual contexts. The temple's influence on daily life in Tenochtitlan extended far beyond ceremonial occasions. Its calendar determined when markets could operate, when marriages could be contracted, when agricultural work should begin or end. The priest astronomers who maintained this calendar possessed mathematical and observational skills that made them essential advisors to rulers and administrators throughout the empire. Common citizens organized their lives around the temple's rhythm. They timed personal ceremonies, business ventures, and family celebrations according to the sacred calendar maintained by temple priests. This integration of religious and secular time created a unified temporal framework that gave coherence and meaning to both individual and community life. The temple's destruction and burial created trauma that extended far beyond the physical loss of buildings and artifacts. For indigenous communities, the temple had been the center of a coherent worldview that made sense of human existence within cosmic order. Its elimination left a spiritual void that colonial religious institutions could never fully fill, despite centuries of evangelization efforts. Indigenous responses to this trauma took many forms. Some communities relocated their religious practices to remote locations where they could continue ancient traditions without interference. Others developed syncretic practices that incorporated Christian symbols and narratives while preserving essential elements of pre-Columbian spirituality. Still others maintained oral traditions that kept alive detailed knowledge of temple ceremonies and their meanings. The rediscovery of the temple in the 20th century has allowed these preserved traditions to reconnect with their material foundations. Indigenous spiritual leaders have worked with archaeologists to interpret discoveries in ways that honor both scientific methodology and traditional knowledge systems. This collaboration has enriched understanding of the temple's significance while validating indigenous intellectual traditions that colonialism had systematically devalued. Contemporary Mexico City continues to reveal connections between its pre-Columbian foundations and its modern identity. Neighborhood shrines often occupy locations that had religious significance before Spanish conquest. Public markets operate in areas that served similar functions in Aztec times. Even traffic patterns sometimes follow routes that were established as ceremonial processional ways centuries ago. The temple's rediscovery has also influenced contemporary Mexican architecture and urban planning. Modern buildings increasingly incorporate design elements that reference pre-Columbian traditions. Public spaces are organized according to principles that acknowledge both colonial and indigenous heritage. Cultural institutions seek ways to present Mexican history as a continuous narrative rather than a series of disconnected periods. International recognition of the temple's significance has elevated Mexico's profile in global archaeological and cultural preservation communities. The techniques developed for urban archaeological excavation in Mexico City have been applied to similar projects in other cities with layered historical foundations. The museum's innovative approaches to displaying and interpreting ancient artifacts have influenced museum design worldwide. The temple's story continues to unfold as new discoveries emerge and new interpretive frameworks are developed. Each archaeological season brings fresh insights that refine understanding of Aztec society and religion. Each scholarly conference generates new questions that guide future research directions. Each museum exhibition reaches new audiences who carry the temple story into contemporary cultural conversations. Beyond the temple complex, in palaces whose foundations also rest beneath the modern city, another world operated according to its own intricate rules. Here, where privilege and responsibility intertwined like threads in the finest textiles, the empire's elite navigated ceremonies as complex as any conducted by the priests, ceremonies of protocol and precedence that maintained the social architecture upon which all else depended. Let's spend a day with an Aztec noble, where luxury and responsibility walk hand in hand, where every gesture carries meaning, and every decision ripples outward through networks of obligation and authority that stretched from private chambers to the farthest reaches of the empire. The sun rises again over Tenochtitlán, casting warm light across the surface of the lake. But today, you are not lost among the market stalls or carrying firewood along narrow paths. Today, you awaken in a noble's household, a place of ordered quiet and soft, deliberate steps. The home is large, but not ostentatious. It is constructed around a central courtyard where morning sunlight spills across smooth stone. The walls are painted in soft earth tones, with touches of bright red or deep blue near the ceiling edges. Birds flit among clay cages. A servant gently stirs a pot of morning chocolate, whisking it with a wooden stick until it foams. Your sleeping chamber is raised slightly above the central courtyard, its entrance covered by a curtain woven from maguey fiber and dyed in subtle patterns that speak of your family's lineage. The walls here are thicker than those of common dwellings, providing both privacy and protection from the sounds of the city that never truly sleeps. Stone sculptures of patron deities watch from alcoves, their faces serene but attentive, carved by artisans whose families have served yours for generations. You are not expected to cook or clean. That is not your role. You are part of the Pipaltan, the hereditary nobility of the Mexica. Your family has served the empire through war, administration, or priesthood, and your privileges come with expectations that stretch back through generations, like roots of an ancient tree. The responsibilities of your birth began before your first breath. When your mother carried you, priests consulted the sacred calendar to determine the most auspicious timing for your arrival. Your name was chosen not merely for its sound, but for its connection to the day signs that would govern your destiny. The Tonalpahuli, the Count of Days, marked you as different from the moment you entered this world. You rise with the sun, not from leisure, but because discipline is part of your identity. The servants have been awake for an hour already, preparing the household for your emergence. They move quietly, their bare feet making soft sounds against the polished stone floors. Water has been drawn from the nearby canal while it was still cool and clean, before the activities of the day could muddy its clarity. You wash your hands and face with cool water drawn from a nearby canal, using soap made from the roots of the copaltsucatl plant. The cleansing ritual is both practical and spiritual, a daily renewal that connects you to the flowing waters that give life to your island city. Your teeth are cleaned with ground salt and charcoal, a mixture that keeps them white and strong, marking you as someone who can afford such luxuries. Then you dress, not in rough cotton like the commoners, but in a finely woven cloak, perhaps dyed with cochineal red or indigo blue. The textile speaks volumes about your position. Each thread was spun by skilled hands, dyed with pigments that required careful preparation and considerable expense. The cochineal comes from insects cultivated on prickly pear cacti, each tiny creature contributing its crimson essence to create a color so valued it will one day be traded across oceans. The indigo flows from plants that must be processed at exactly the right moment, their leaves transformed through careful fermentation into the deep blue that rivals the sky itself. A jade pendant rests against your chest, cool and polished smooth. This stone is more precious than gold to your people, each piece carefully selected for its color and clarity. The jade came from distant lands, carried by traders who risked their lives crossing mountains and rivers to bring such treasures to Tenochtitlan. It has been shaped by craftsmen whose families have worked stone for generations, their techniques passed down through whispered instructions and careful observation. The pendant is not merely decorative. It carries meaning that runs deeper than beauty. Jade represents water, the vital force that sustains all life. It speaks of your connection to the sacred cenotes and springs, to the rain that falls from Tlaloc's realm, to the very essence of renewal and growth. When you wear it, you carry with you a reminder of the responsibilities that flow from privilege. Your sandals are crafted from leather, so supple it moves like cloth, decorated with patterns that identify your Kelpuli, your neighborhood and kinship group within the great city. Even these functional items become statements of identity, marking you as belonging to a particular place in the complex social fabric that holds Tenochtitlan together. Breakfast is light. Tamales filled with squash blossoms or beans, and a small cup of chocolate spiced with chili. You eat in silence, with your household maintaining a respectful stillness around you. Speech is measured here. Politeness is not a nicety, but a structure that holds the social world in its proper alignment. The tamales have been prepared since before dawn, the masa ground from corn that was first soaked in lime water to remove the hulls and unlock the essential nutrients within. This process, called nixtamalization, transforms simple kernels into the foundation of life itself. The corn used for your breakfast comes from tribute delivered by distant communities, each grain a small acknowledgement of your family's place in the imperial hierarchy. The squash blossoms were picked this morning while still closed, their delicate orange petals harboring a subtle sweetness that will disappear once the sun fully opens them. The beans are small and dark, varieties cultivated in the floating gardens that surround your city like green jewels set in blue water. Each ingredient in your simple meal represents a complex network of agricultural knowledge, trade relationships, and social obligations that stretch across the empire. The chocolate demands special attention. The cacao beans have traveled from the hot, humid lowlands where they grow in the shade of larger trees. They have been roasted to bring out their deep, complex flavors, then ground on metates, volcanic stone surfaces that crush the beans into a smooth paste. The servant who prepares your morning drink knows exactly how much water to add, how long to whisk the mixture, and precisely when to add the chili that will awaken your senses for the day ahead. This drink is not the sweet confection that will later delight foreign palates. Your chocolate is bitter and intense, flavored with spices that make your mouth tingle and your mind sharpen. Some mornings, vanilla is added, its perfume rising from the cup like incense. Other days, honey sweetens the mixture slightly, or ground maize thickens it into something more substantial. Each variation serves a purpose, preparing your body and spirit for the specific challenges that await. Soon after, the day begins in earnest. If you serve in the Kalakak, the school for noble sons, your morning may begin with study. This institution stands apart from the common schools, its very architecture declaring its special purpose. The buildings are arranged around courtyards where students gather in small groups, their voices rising and falling in the rhythms of memorized speeches and sacred songs. History, astronomy, sacred chants, and law are memorized through repetition. But this is not mere rote learning. Each recitation connects you to the great chain of knowledge that stretches back to the founding of your people. When you chant the migration stories, you walk again with the ancestors who left Aztlan in search of the promised land. When you study the movements of Venus, you participate in the cosmic order that governs all existence. The astronomical knowledge you absorb is staggering in its precision and complexity. You learn to track the synodic period of Venus, understanding how this bright wanderer appears as both morning and evening star in cycles that span 584 days. You memorize the relationships between different calendar systems, grasping how the 260-day tonal Pahuli intersects with the 365-day solar year to create great cycles of time that encompass both human life and cosmic renewal. Mathematics flows through these studies like water through carefully engineered channels. You learn to calculate tribute obligations for distant provinces, to determine the optimal timing for military campaigns, to predict eclipses that might otherwise terrify the common people. Numbers become tools for understanding divine will, for managing imperial resources, for maintaining the delicate balance between human needs and sacred obligations. The law you study is not written in books, but inscribed in memory. Each precedent and principle preserved through careful teaching and constant practice. You learn not just what the rules are, but why they exist, how they serve to maintain harmony between individuals and communities, between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. Justice is not an abstract concept, but a living force that must be continuously renewed through right action and careful judgment. If you are older, you may serve as a judge or administrator, reviewing petitions and resolving disputes from your local Kalpuli. Decisions are expected to be fair, but also to preserve harmony. Your rulings are made with care, each judgment weighed against precedent and principle, against the needs of individuals and the welfare of the community. The disputes that come before you reveal the intricate complexities of life in Tenochtitlan. Property boundaries shift with the changing water levels of the lake. creating conflicts between neighbors who once lived in harmony. Marriage arrangements founder when families disagree about the value of bride gifts or the obligations of in-laws. Artisans quarrel over the quality of materials or the timing of deliveries for important commissions. Each case requires you to understand not just the immediate facts, but the broader context that gives them meaning. A disagreement about fishing rights in a particular canal might reflect deeper tensions between Kaupuli or concerns about the environmental health of the lake system. A complaint about the quality of tribute textiles might signal problems in distant provinces that could eventually threaten the stability of the empire itself. Your training has prepared you to listen carefully, to ask questions that reveal hidden motivations, to propose solutions that address underlying causes rather than merely surface symptoms. You understand that your authority derives not from personal power, but from your position as a conduit for divine justice, a responsibility that requires constant vigilance and humility. If you are a warrior, and many noblemen are, you train each day. The calm movements of morning give way to sharp bursts of motion. The Machua Weedle is heavy, but familiar, its obsidian blades sharp enough to shave the fine hairs from your arm. Each piece of volcanic glass carefully napped and secured with binding that has been blessed by priests. Your training ground is a dedicated space within your family compound. Its packed earth surface, marked with patterns that guide your movements through the combat forms that have been perfected over generations. Wooden posts of varying heights serve as practice opponents, their surfaces scarred by countless strikes from student warriors learning to channel controlled violence in service of the Empire. You practice your stance, your timing, feeling the weight of the weapon shift as you move through attack and defense sequences. The Machua Weedle is not merely a tool for killing, but an extension of your body and spirit, its movements flowing from principles that govern all aspects of Mexican life. Balance, precision, patience, and explosive power must be perfectly coordinated, each element supporting the others in harmonious integration. Perhaps you are preparing for a campaign or reviewing captives taken in a previous one. These men are not executed immediately. Their fate is part of a greater ritual calendar that governs the relationship between warfare and sacred obligation. Captives represent more than military victory. They embody the cosmic principle of sacrifice that maintains the universe in its proper functioning. The preparation for campaign involves more than individual skill with weapons. You must understand logistics, the complex calculations required to move armies across varied terrain while maintaining supply lines and communication with the capital. You study maps drawn on bark paper, their stylized representations encoding information about water sources, defensive positions, potential allies, and likely enemy responses. Military intelligence flows through networks of traders and diplomats who travel between city-states, gathering information that might prove crucial when conflict arrives. You learn to evaluate these reports critically, understanding how personal interests and cultural assumptions might color the facts. The difference between reliable intelligence and wishful thinking can determine the success or failure of entire campaigns. The weapons you master extend beyond the makuyul to include the tapastapili, a thrusting spear with an obsidian point that can penetrate the quilted cotton armor worn by enemy warriors. You train with the atlalu, the spear thrower that multiplies the force of your arm to send darts across distances that would be impossible with hand-thrown projectiles. Each weapon demands its own set of skills, its own understanding of timing and distance and opportunity. If you are a priest, your time is spent in temples or sacred gardens. The rituals are precise, often exhausting. Fasting, prayer, and long hours in dimly lit spaces. The gods must be honored with flowers, blood, incense, and song. The cost of error is not measured in punishment, but in imbalance that can ripple through the cosmos with devastating consequences. The temple complex where you serve rises above the city like a mountain constructed by human hands, its stepped pyramid reaching toward the realm of the gods. The climb to the summit requires both physical strength and spiritual preparation, each level representing a different stage in the journey from earthly concerns to divine communion. Your priestly duties begin before dawn with the kindling of sacred fires that must never be allowed to die completely. The fuel for these flames comes from specific types of wood, each chosen for its spiritual properties and prepared according to rituals that have been maintained since the founding of the city. Pine for purification, oak for strength, cedar for its sweet smoke. It carries prayers upward to the heavens. The sacred gardens under your care contain plants gathered from across the empire and beyond, each species cultivated for its role in religious ceremonies. Copal trees provide the resin that becomes incense, their tears of amber hardening into precious offerings that dissolve in flames to create the smoke that feeds the gods. Tobacco plants grow in careful rows, their leaves dried and prepared for ritual use that induces visions and opens channels of communication with divine forces. Fasting is not merely the absence of food, but a positive discipline that sharpens spiritual perception and demonstrates devotion to powers greater than human appetite. During the most intense periods of ritual observance, you consume only water and perhaps a small amount of ground maize mixed with sacred herbs. Your body becomes lighter, more sensitive to the subtle energies that flow through the ceremonial spaces. The bloodletting that forms part of your religious obligations is performed with obsidian blades, so sharp their edges approach the molecular level. The blood that flows from carefully made incisions is not merely a symbol of sacrifice, but a living gift that carries your essence directly to the gods. Maguey thorns serve for smaller offerings, their points drawing forth droplets that stain bark paper with patterns of devotion. Even among the noble class, life is structured, watched, and weighted with responsibility that extends far beyond personal comfort or satisfaction. The watchers are everywhere, though they move so quietly through the social landscape that their presence is felt rather than seen. Servants report on the behavior of their masters, noting signs of discontent or disloyalty that might require intervention. Merchants carry information along with their trade goods, their observations of provincial attitudes becoming intelligence that helps maintain imperial control. Your children are educated not only in skills and knowledge, but in the subtle art of reading social currents, of understanding how personal actions ripple through the networks of obligation and alliance that hold the empire together. They learn to speak carefully, to choose their companions wisely, to remember that even casual comments might be interpreted as political statements by those whose job it is to maintain stability. The weight of responsibility manifests in countless small decisions throughout each day. The gifts you choose to give to visiting officials must be appropriate to their rank and the nature of your relationship, neither so lavish as to suggest inappropriate ambition, nor so modest as to indicate disrespect. The marriages you arrange for your children must balance personal compatibility with political advantage, creating alliances that serve your family's interests while supporting broader imperial goals. By midday, you may be summoned to the palace. The Tlatoani, the ruler, meets regularly with nobles, and these gatherings are orchestrated with a precision that would impress the most demanding choreographer. Every gesture, every word, every moment of silence carries meaning that extends far beyond its immediate context. The palace itself overwhelms with its scale and sophistication. Courtyards larger than entire commoner neighborhoods are filled with exotic plants and animals collected from across the known world. Fountains fed by ingenious hydraulic systems create cooling sprays that make the air sparkle with tiny rainbows. The walls are covered with murals depicting the great deeds of previous rulers, their achievements preserved in pigments that glow with an almost supernatural intensity. He sits on a reed mat, shaded by woven fabric that ripples in the breeze like captured water. The mat beneath him is not the simple pei-tade used by common people, but a masterwork of the weaver's art, its patterns incorporating threads of gold and brilliant feathers that create images of cosmic significance. The canopy above provides shade, while allowing the play of light and shadow to emphasize the ruler's movements with theatrical effect. He speaks slowly and clearly, and those who listen do so with bowed heads, understanding that direct eye contact would be presumptuous and potentially dangerous. His words are chosen with the same care that master craftsmen use in selecting materials for their most important works. Each phrase has been considered not only for its immediate meaning, but for its implications, its potential interpretations, its effects on the complex web of relationships that hold the empire together. The Tlatoani is not merely a man, but a vessel of divine responsibility who serves as the primary intermediary between the human world and the realm of the gods. His decisions affect not only the immediate welfare of his subjects, but the cosmic balance that maintains universal order. The burden of such responsibility is reflected in the lines that mark his face, the careful deliberation that precedes his every statement, the isolation that surrounds him even in the midst of crowds. Politics here is delicate, a dance performed on the edge of precipices where a single misstep might lead to catastrophic falls. Nobles walk a narrow line between power and obedience, their influence balanced against the constant need to demonstrate loyalty and submission to higher authority. The art lies in advancing personal and family interests while appearing to serve only the greater good of the empire. Marriage alliances are strategic instruments that require generations of planning and careful negotiation. A union between two noble families creates not only personal bonds, but political connections that might prove crucial during times of crisis or opportunity. The children born from such marriages carry, within their very existence, the hopes and ambitions of multiple lineages, their future success or failure reflecting on ancestors both living and dead. Loyalty is often proven through gifts that demonstrate both devotion and capability. The tribute you offer to superiors must be impressive enough to indicate respect while remaining within the bounds of propriety. Too little suggests contempt or poverty. Too much implies dangerous ambition or inappropriate wealth. The calculation of appropriate giving requires sophisticated understanding of social dynamics and economic realities. Military success provides another avenue for demonstrating worth. But even here, the complexities multiply beyond simple victory or defeat. The captives you take must be of appropriate rank to reflect well on your prowess while not overshadowing the achievements of more senior commanders. The spoils you claim must be shared according to established precedent, while still providing adequate reward for your efforts and risks. The sponsorship of religious festivals offers opportunities to display piety and prosperity while serving the broader needs of the community. These events require enormous investments of time, energy, and resources, their success depending on coordination between multiple groups of specialists, ranging from architects and engineers to musicians and dancers. Your role as sponsor makes you responsible not only for the immediate logistics, but for the spiritual efficacy of the entire celebration. And always, there is the quiet whisper of fate, the understanding that human plans and ambitions operate within cosmic cycles that dwarf individual lifespans. The gods decide the ultimate outcomes of mortal endeavors, their will expressed through the intricate patterns of the sacred calendar. The calendar speaks through the voices of priest astronomers who study the movements of celestial bodies and divine the optimal timing for important undertakings. Back at your estate, the late afternoon brings a different rhythm, one more attuned to the subtle pleasures that make life worth living even under the weight of constant obligation. The transition from public duty to private reflection requires its own rituals of preparation, its own careful adjustment of mental and spiritual focus. You may visit your gardens, shaded by broad-leafed plants and tended by careful hands that understand the delicate balance between human intention and natural process. These spaces serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They provide food for your household, medicines for treating illness, materials for religious ceremonies, and places of beauty where the mind can find respite from the pressures of political life. The gardens are arranged according to principles that reflect both practical needs and aesthetic ideals. Raised beds prevent flooding during the rainy season, while providing optimal drainage for plants that prefer drier conditions. Terraced slopes maximize growing space while creating visual interest through the interplay of different levels and textures. Water channels distribute moisture efficiently, while creating the gentle sounds that soothe the spirit and mask conversations that require privacy. Perhaps you observe artisans under your patronage, such as feather workers, potters, and weavers, each creating objects of reverence or tribute. Beauty is not idle here. It is sacred, a manifestation of divine creativity working through human hands and hearts. The feather workers represent the pinnacle of artistic achievement in your world, their creations rivaling anything produced by the greatest masters in distant lands. They work with materials so delicate that a misplaced breath might destroy hours of labor. The emerald green of quetzaltail feathers, the brilliant red of cardinal plumage, the subtle blues and yellows of tropical birds, whose names are known only to the hunters who risk their lives to capture them. Each feather must be carefully cleaned, sorted, and prepared before it can be incorporated into the final design. The adhesives used to secure them are made from plant resins mixed with other organic materials, their properties adjusted to provide the right combination of strength and flexibility. The backing materials require equal attention, their surfaces prepared to receive the fragile ornaments that will transform them into objects of transcendent beauty. The designs themselves emerge from a collaborative process that involves not only the primary artist, but advisors who understand religious symbolism, historical precedent, and political significance. A ceremonial shield might incorporate representations of patron deities, references to military victories, and abstract patterns that encode information about the owner's lineage and achievements. Every element must work together to create a unified whole that speaks simultaneously to aesthetic sensibility and cultural meaning. The potters under your patronage work with clays gathered from specific locations around the lake, each source providing materials with distinctive properties and colors. The finest vessels emerge from earth, taken from sacred sites, their very substance carrying spiritual significance that enhances their function as containers for ritual offerings or domestic use. The techniques they employ have been refined over centuries of experimentation and tradition, passed down through family lines that guard their secrets, while slowly accumulating innovations that improve upon ancestral methods. Firing temperatures must be precisely controlled to achieve the desired hardness and color. The fuel arranged to create oxidizing or reducing atmospheres that bring out particular effects in the finished clay. Decorative techniques range from simple geometric patterns, incised while the clay is still soft, to complex painted designs, applied after the first firing and secured through additional heat treatment. Some pieces incorporate materials that transform during firing, copper compounds that produce lustrous metallic surfaces, organic materials that burn away to leave intricate textural effects, minerals that flux and flow to create glazes of extraordinary depth and brilliance. The weavers represent perhaps the most fundamental of all artistic traditions, their work providing not only clothing and household textiles, but the very fabric from which social identity is constructed. The patterns they create encode information about regional origins, family affiliations, religious devotions, and personal achievements, making every garment a readable text for those who understand the symbolic language of thread and color. The raw materials they transform arrive at your workshop from across the empire and beyond. Cotton from the hot coastal lowlands, maguey fiber from the central highlands, rabbit fur from the mountains, silk from wild cocoons gathered in distant forests. Each material demands its own specialized treatment, its own understanding of how natural properties can be enhanced or modified to serve human purposes. The dyeing process alone requires mastery of complex chemical interactions between plant materials, mordants, and fibers. Some colors emerge from single sources. The deep red of cochineal insects, the purple of certain mollusks, the yellow of specific flowers. Others result from combinations that must be applied in precise sequences to achieve the desired hues and ensure their permanence. The looms on which these materials are transformed into finished textiles represent sophisticated mechanical devices that allow enormous control over the structure and appearance of the final products. Backstrap looms provide intimacy and portability for smaller projects, while larger fixed installations enable the creation of textiles too wide or complex for individual workers to manage alone. Dinner is modest, often shared with close family and a visiting official whose presence transforms the meal into another opportunity for political maneuvering disguised as hospitality. The conversation is formal, filled with proverbs and respectful silence that allows each participant to consider carefully the implications of what is said and what is left unspoken. The dining space itself reflects the dual nature of these gatherings, intimate enough to encourage genuine communication, while formal enough to maintain appropriate social distinctions. Low tables hold the various dishes, their surfaces polished to mirror brightness, and decorated with inlaid patterns that catch and reflect the flickering light of torches and oil lamps. Corn, beans, and chili remain staples, but they are prepared with skill that transforms humble ingredients into expressions of culinary artistry. A dish flavored with epazote might incorporate techniques that concentrate and balance the herbs, distinctive taste while mellowing its more assertive qualities. Perhaps grilled fish from the lake appears, its flesh perfumed with smoke from carefully chosen woods and seasoned with spice blends that complement rather than overwhelm its delicate flavor. The fish themselves represent the bounty of the lake system that sustains your city, their availability reflecting the health of the aquatic ecosystems that your people have learned to manage with sophisticated understanding of natural cycles and human impact. The grilling techniques concentrate flavors while preserving moisture. The heat applied with precision that comes from generations of accumulated knowledge about how different species respond to various cooking methods. Meat is rare, but not absent, its scarcity making each appearance a small celebration that acknowledges both the value of animal protein and the ethical complexities of taking life for sustenance. When meat does appear on your table, it has been prepared with special care, its preparation involving rituals of gratitude that honor the creature's sacrifice and ensure that its death serves purposes worthy of the gift of life. The beverages served with dinner extend beyond simple thirst quenching to include preparations that serve specific social and physiological functions. Flavored waters provide refreshment while cleansing the palate between different courses. Fermented drinks offer mild intoxication that loosens tongues without compromising judgment, their alcohol content carefully controlled through traditional brewing techniques that balance flavor, potency, and social appropriateness. As the evening deepens, candles are lit, not wax, but torches of resin and plant fiber, glowing softly in clay holders that have been crafted specifically for this purpose. The light they provide is warm and intimate, creating pools of illumination that draw people together while leaving the spaces between in comfortable shadow. These lights represent more than simple illumination. They are offerings to the darkness, acknowledgments of the daily cycle that governs all existence. The materials from which they are made carry their own spiritual significance. Pine resin, it purifies the air while it burns cotton fibers that connect the light to the textile traditions that clothe and comfort humanity. Clay holders that ground the flame in earth while allowing it to reach toward heaven. You retire to your private chamber, sparsely furnished but clean and orderly, its simplicity reflecting values that prize function and meaning over mere display. Servants wait outside the walls, ready to respond to any need while respecting the boundaries that preserve your privacy and dignity. The chamber's austerity serves multiple purposes beyond mere aesthetic preference. It reduces distractions that might interfere with the contemplation and rest that prepare you for tomorrow's challenges. It demonstrates the self-discipline that distinguishes nobility from those who mistake luxury for virtue. It acknowledges the impermanence of material possessions and the ultimate equality that death brings to all human conditions. The sounds of the city grow quiet as night establishes its dominion over the daylight hours. From your elevated position, you can hear the gentle lapping of water against the stone foundations of buildings, the distant calls of night birds hunting in the reedy margins of the lake, the soft conversations of guards making their rounds through the darkened streets. Still, your mind does not rest even as your body prepares for sleep. You think of tribute schedules that must be coordinated with seasonal cycles and military campaigns, of logistics that grow more complex as the empire expands into regions with different resources and different needs. The mathematical calculations involved in managing these flows of goods and people challenge even the most sophisticated accounting systems your civilization has developed. You consider your son's progress in his studies, weighing his achievements against the standards expected of his generation and social position. His success or failure will reflect not only on his individual character, but on your family's ability to maintain its position within the competitive hierarchy of noble families. The education he receives must prepare him not only for specific roles, but for the adaptability that survival requires in a world where circumstances can change with devastating suddenness. The upcoming ceremonies in the Temple District occupy another portion of your mental attention. Their successful completion, depending on coordination between multiple groups whose interests and priorities do not always align perfectly. Your financial contributions must be calibrated to demonstrate appropriate piety without creating obligations you cannot fulfill or expectations you cannot meet. You wonder if the emperor is content with your service, or if your name will be called for something greater that might elevate your family's status, but also expose you to greater risks and more demanding expectations. The balance between ambition and caution requires constant recalibration as circumstances change and new opportunities emerge. Political currents flow beneath the surface of daily life like underground rivers, their presence felt even when their exact courses remain hidden. Alliances shift in response to changing conditions. Marriages create new connections while dissolving others. And the death of key figures opens possibilities while closing off paths that once seemed secure. You are a noble, but you are not free in any sense that later ages might recognize or understand. Each day is tightly wound in expectations that constrain your choices while defining your identity. Your comfort is matched by duty that extends far beyond personal preference or immediate desire. Your status rests on a fragile web of relationships, rituals, and results that must be constantly maintained through careful attention and appropriate action. The freedom you possess operates within carefully defined parameters, like a river that flows powerfully within its banks, but cannot exceed the boundaries that give it form and direction. Your education has prepared you to navigate these constraints skillfully, but it has also made you aware of their absolute necessity for maintaining the social order that supports your privileged position. The responsibilities that come with your birth and education extend beyond your individual lifetime to encompass obligations to ancestors whose achievements created your current opportunities, and to descendants who will inherit the consequences of your decisions. This temporal dimension adds weight to every choice, making each action part of a larger pattern that spans generations. And as you drift to sleep, listening to the wind moving gently over the lake, you know that even high walls and fine garments do not shield you from the turning of the calendar that governs all existence with mathematical precision and divine authority. Everything is watched by eyes both human and divine. Every action recorded in memories that span generations and in cosmic accounts that will be balanced when the current age reaches its inevitable conclusion. Everything is remembered by the living, who preserve the stories and lessons of the past, and by the gods, who weigh each soul according to standards that transcend human understanding. The calendar turns with remorseless precision, marking the passage of days and years with ceremonies that acknowledge both the predictability of natural cycles and the uncertainty of human fortune. Your comfortable chamber cannot protect you from the cosmic forces that determine the rise and fall of empires, the success and failure of individual lives, the ultimate meaning of all earthly endeavors. And so, from market stalls to temple steps, from battlefield to private garden, we've walked through the world of Tenochtitlan, a city filled with movement, order, and meaning that emerges from the constant interaction between human intention and divine will. A place where nothing was accidental, and everything, even the stars, had their proper place in the great pattern that encompasses all existence. The noble life we have witnessed represents only one strand in the complex tapestry of Mexican society, but it reveals the principles and values that shaped an entire civilization. The balance between privilege and responsibility, between individual ambition and collective welfare, between human agency and cosmic destiny, creates tensions that drive both personal development and cultural evolution. Now, let us ease into the quiet of reflection and return gently to the present, carrying with us the understanding that nobility, in any age and any culture, demands not just the enjoyment of privileges, but the acceptance of burdens that test the limits of human strength and wisdom. But even as we prepare to leave this world of careful protocols and ancient wisdom, one question lingers in the perfumed air of the noble's chamber. What happens when this carefully balanced world encounters forces from beyond its borders? When strangers arrive bearing gifts and diseases in equal measure? When the very calendar that has guided this civilization for centuries begins to whisper of an ending that no amount of noble blood or priestly knowledge can prevent? And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. From the crowded markets of Tenochtitlan to the final echoes of the siege. From the buried stones beneath Mexico City to the quiet halls of the noble estates. A long, slow journey through the layered rhythm of an empire that once ruled the lake. If you're still awake, thanks for coming all the way with me. And if you drifted off somewhere between the temple chants and the marketplace alleys, that's perfectly fine too. That's kind of the idea. If you enjoyed this slower, sleep-friendly dive into history, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it was when you pressed play. I always enjoy seeing where these late-night journeys are finding their way. For now, I'll let the drums fade into silence, the canals still, and the torchlight flicker gently out. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.